In the fall of 1994, 46-year-old Elizabeth Harrington made a bold choice to reset her life in the small historic city of Fredericksburg, Virginia. After the tedious and long battle against alcoholism and depression, she decided it was time to leave those struggles behind and have a fresh start. In Fredericksburg, Elizabeth found River Place, a halfway house that was a home for people struggling with mental health issues and were entangled in substance abuse or criminal tendency. However, fate had a different plan for the talented artist. Something cruel and unexpected. On November 3, 1994, her lifeless body was discovered in the apartment. At first sight, it was evident she went through a vicious assault. The promising artist's dreams to reclaim her life were cut short, leaving the world mourning over such a tragic loss. Who was the murderer who evaded the law for almost a decade? And most importantly, what was the killer's motive? Along with the baggage of her past, did Elizabeth bring any unresolved saga of hatred into the new life she was building for herself? Fredericksburg is a beloved spot for numerous people and families. It is a tight-knit community where everyone supports each other. There are plenty of attractions for the public to enjoy, like the scenic Rappahannock River and the vibrant downtown area. In Fredericksburg, Virginia, crime rates soar above the national average now. However, murder occurrences remained highly uncommon in Fredericksburg back in the 90s. Despite being the city in which Elizabeth sowed the seeds of her new life, it failed to offer safety to flourish. As the world slept peacefully, she battled against death's grip, ultimately succumbing to its grasp. The beautiful artist hailed from a family of accomplished individuals, including artists, lawyers, and business people. Her mother, Neva Harrington, herself is a poet and a former creative writing teacher at Northern Virginia Community College. Elizabeth held a master's degree in studio art from the University of Texas at Austin. However, her life wasn't all rainbows and glitters. Despite having a stable background, she was admitted in hospital several times due to issues like heart attack and nervous breakdown. In the fall of 1994, Neva Harrington had been making arrangements to move to Fredericksburg, intending to keep a closer watch on her daughter. Just weeks before Elizabeth's tragic death, they visited Fredericksburg together to search for apartments. She would have reclaimed her life, but fate had something tragic in store for her. Every day, Elizabeth received a visit from one of her social workers, Dawn Perchetti. Dawn describes Elizabeth as pleasant, independent, and not requiring much supervision. Her apartment is always tidy and neat, showing that she could thrive on her own.
Well, I remember her. She was very pleasant, very independent. She didn't need a lot of supervision, and she kept her apartment really neat and tidy. It looked really good for her. She could have done really well on her own.
One November morning, Perchetti went on her usual rounds a little after 8 a.m. To her surprise, she found Elizabeth's front door unlocked and slightly open. Inside, there was no trace of her, and the apartment was in shambles. This was unlike Elizabeth, and Perchetti was very concerned. She felt something was wrong and began calling out. "Elizabeth, come on, it's time to get up," she called out repeatedly. But Elizabeth didn't reply. Perchetti decided to check in and went upstairs to her room. What she witnessed was beyond grim. Elizabeth was laying on the bed with her face down. She was covered in blood, and a scarf was wrapped around her neck. It was clear that Elizabeth had been strangled to death. Soon after, John Lippincott, an analyst, came and began investigating the crime scene. There were signs of a struggle on the first floor, and it seemed that Elizabeth was dragged to her room where she was killed. From the signs and initial investigation from the body, the poor soul was attacked from behind. Before realizing what happened, she had succumbed to a painful death. Although John stated about a possible assault, no semen was discovered in the autopsy.
The ligature appeared to be a scarf of some kind that had been wrapped around the victim's neck and tightened. The body was positioned, and it appeared that she had been assaulted from the back, from the way the body was laying and the pants being pulled down and so forth.
This had the investigators confused. If assault wasn't the murder motive, then what could it have been? To confirm this, they sent the victim's clothing and bedding to the state crime lab, hoping forensic analysis could uncover traces of the killer's bodily fluids. The day she met her tragic fate, she was out at a bar called Merriman's with a local named Matt. Waverly Musselman from the police department believed she was counseling him, attempting to assist him with the questions and problems he was facing at the time.
I think she was counseling him, trying to help him through some of the questions that he had at the time, some of the things that he perceived as problems.
Having faced the darkness of depression, she believed helping out others was also essential in her healing journey. Musselman questioned Matt. However, he couldn't find any potential evidence for claiming Matt might be the murderer. Matt claimed that after leaving the bar, they talked in the car for some time and waved to each other goodnight at 10 p.m.
I had several interviews with Matt because I felt like Matt did know more about this case than he was giving up.
The police tried their best to dig in and find any mismatch in his statement by having several interviews. But all they could figure out was he was in fact hiding something. The police now had a shot at investigating the guests at River Place. They hoped that would give them the solid evidence they were looking for. Although they could come up with several scenarios connecting the guests, it was a dead end. It felt like the trail had gone cold, and the killer had already covered his tracks. Almost a year had passed with no development in sight, but Musselman never relented in his search. They knew that however clever the criminal is, there would always be proof that is waiting to be discovered. And that was true in Elizabeth's case, too. A man walked into Musselman's office with the story they were longing to hear. On June 2nd, 1995, a man named Archie Talley walked into the cop's office to share a story that eventually helped to deliver justice to Elizabeth Harrington. Talley, a cook, often found himself in and out of shelters, living a transient lifestyle. Under the bridge, he considered the hard pavement his home. Being both black and gay, he faced threats from a woman and a man under the bridge. They even made death threats. He was also a regular at Merriman. Despite that, Musselman was instantly intrigued. The fact that both Talley and Elizabeth were seen at Merriman's, a bar known for its gay clientele, struck him as significant. He sensed there might be more to the story than what initially met the eye. So Musselman decided to conduct further interviews with Talley in hopes of uncovering evidence related to the murder. Shockingly, Talley revealed that the attackers had mentioned Elizabeth's murder, sharing details that seemed relevant.
Now, you were telling me that one or both of them said something about
she needed to shoot her, and the homosexual got there. There's no purpose there. The girl was on the bed, something that they had tied around his neck. The chain is back on his neck.
While the tip didn't directly tie to Elizabeth's murder, Detective Musselman saw it as a chance to reignite the investigation. Despite Musselman's efforts, he couldn't establish a connection between the individuals Talley mentioned. Unwilling to give up, he continued to work on the case tirelessly. However, even after a year passed, Musselman still couldn't unravel the mystery. Eventually, he reluctantly accepted that Elizabeth's murder would join the long list of cold cases. 7 years went by, and Talley was now in an improved situation. He found a secured shelter and moved into a second-story flat with his latest boyfriend. However, their relationship was far from affectionate. One fine day, his boyfriend decided to make a visit to the sheriff's office. He had disturbing details to share as well. He was alarmed to find out that Talley had been harboring dark thoughts of killing in his sleep. What was disturbing was he was proud to express his disturbing fantasies to his partner. Talley told him that he was just lucky to be alive, as he had considered pouring gasoline on him while he was asleep.
He had said so many times, "You just don't know how lucky you are." I sit there and watch you lay in that bed sleeping and stuff, and so many times I thought about setting gasoline to you and killing you.
That wasn't all. Talley even bragged to him about killing people in the past. Detective Perkins now had one way to entangle the story. So they sent the boyfriend back and gave him a police wire to gather more solid evidence. The very next day, asked a local newspaper reporter for a favor. He wanted to rekindle Talley's memory. An article appeared in the newspaper with a headline, "Cop to Killer, Give Up Now. Detective Convinced Arrest Will Be Made in City Slaying."
So on the following day, she comes out with an article, "Cop to Killer, Give Up Now."
Now all that was needed was to make Talley brag once again about killing people. Talley's boyfriend subtly triggered him to discuss Elizabeth's murder as the article came out. He brushed off by stating that the detectives were stupid.
I was like, "What is all this, Archie? What's going on and stuff about this woman?" And he's like, "Oh, they trying to pin something on me, but them bitches, they stupid and stuff."
And were simply trying to frame him. Then came the crucial question. He inquired about how he knew Elizabeth Harrington. For that, he replied that he crossed paths with her at Merriman's. He saw her with his ex-boyfriend Matt at the bar while he was partying.
At Merriman, I met her one time there. You know, I didn't meet her. I went there at a party, and my ex was there with her at.
To me, it's just confirmed the motive. He called his ex with this woman, so now he is going to go confront her, either to confront him, thinking maybe he is there at the apartment with her, or he's just going to confront her about being with his lover.
By now, the police came to a conclusion that Talley might have gotten jealous and could have confronted Elizabeth at her apartment. He must have thought that Matt was spending the night with her. Elizabeth had several wounds on her body. That was the main reason why police didn't suspect that the blood found in the scene was not hers. So they didn't double-check. Since Talley was now considered as the suspect, the police felt it would help a great deal if they were to check the evidence from the scene once again. The scarf that had been wrapped around her neck underwent another thorough inspection, with lab analysis Bob Scanlon meticulously examining every inch. Despite his determination, he primarily discovered traces of the victim's DNA alone. Refusing to give up, Bob Scanlon persisted until he finally uncovered an area of the scarf containing a mixture of both Elizabeth's and Talley's DNA.
Sure enough, came up with a couple of samples, showed mixture. consistent with Frances Elizabeth Harrington's type and Archie Talley's.
This discovery boosted his confidence, leading him to a section of the scarf where only Talley's DNA was present.
There was one area that I tested that actually was his DNA type alone.
This was a eureka moment for all those who struggled to find a solid breakthrough in the cold case. Bob was on cloud nine, as it felt like finding closure was finally possible after all these years. Philip Fines, the Deputy Commonwealth's attorney, asserted that the time had come for Talley to be held accountable without any room for excuses.
I was very happy because I knew that now we had some good solid evidence that Mr. Talley wasn't going to be able to explain away.
With the missing piece of the puzzle in hand, they were prepared to bring justice to the case. Taken in for questioning once more, Talley adopted a defensive stance, repeatedly asserting, "You didn't catch me." He shifted blame onto the police, accusing them of incompetence and insisting he was being framed.
He was very defensive and just would say that you did that, not me. Basically, I felt blaming the police for setting him up in some way.
However, when the detectives informed him of the concrete evidence they had against him, Talley remained indifferent, simply stating, "That doesn't mean anything to me."
That don't mean to me. That don't mean nothing to me.
Well, I'll tell you what.
Not a damn thing to me.
It's going to mean everything to a jury.
Then therefore, okay, let's get it on. Okay?
Well, you'll get your day in court.
Anyway.
Aware that the situation wouldn't end favorably for him, Talley opted for an Alford plea, choosing not to plead guilty. However, his efforts proved futile as the police possessed concrete evidence against him.
If they found all this at her crib, wouldn't they came and locked my ass up years ago? If I killed any body, you think I would have stayed in this white town? Do you really think I would have stayed here?
Consequently, he was convicted and sentenced to 80 years in prison. Even if he were to admit to the crime, the outcome would remain unchanged, and the sentence would remain the same. After a long battle, Talley passed away in 2018 at the age of 58. After over 8 years of the case being cold, the police finally made an arrest on December 23, 2002, with the murder shedding light on a much darker aspect of life in this small, historic city. Talley had a troubled history of drug abuse, frequently cycling in and out of jail and shelters. Even the shelter staff found it hard to believe he was capable of murder. While he was confrontational and argumentative, he had never displayed violent behavior before. Talley's aunt, Joan Washington, described him as very friendly. Talley himself was clear with his relatives and attorney, stating that he had been attacked by white supremacists, who followed him all the way to Merriman's. He claimed to have fled for several blocks to reach the police and report the attack. However, he claimed that the police didn't give much heed to his statement about the assailants mentioning killing someone. Talley believes the law has been unjust to him because of his race, feeling that the town wouldn't care anyways. Detective Perkins, however, refuted Talley's claim, stating that there were no reports of him being attacked by alleged racists, and he would have investigated if such an incident had been reported. Talley's attorney, on the other hand, asserted that his client clearly confessed to being attacked by a white man and woman. The hair found at the crime scene was promptly submitted to the state DNA lab. However, technicians informed Fredericksburg police that there was minimal data in the statewide DNA database, making comparisons difficult. Detective Perkins mentioned that the hair was resubmitted in 1997, and eventually, a match was made with Talley, casting suspicion on him as a suspect. Furthermore, the case strongly favored the prosecution as forensic evidence, including a hair found at the crime scene, matched Talley's DNA. His prior drug-related cases also meant that his records were readily available in the system, streamlining the investigation process. Despite expressing gratitude for Perkins' dedication and harboring hope that the right person has been apprehended, Neva Harrington finds little solace in Talley's arrest. She struggles to comprehend the vengefulness exhibited by some victims' families, and feels that her sense of grief remains unchanged. Elizabeth's mother, Neva Harrington, age 76, who was residing in Alexandria, noted that, "Having counselors coming in the morning and at night, I thought she'd never been safer." As the curtain falls on this riveting tale, we invite you to join in on the conversation. Do you think Elizabeth Harrington's murder was an extraordinary twist of fate or a mere coincidence? Do you suspect that Talley was a scapegoat in the case, as he suggested, till the end?
The DNA, where it's at, how it is, directly puts you there. You didn't meet her in a bar.
I have nothing to do with this girl and her being killed and left here. I have nothing to do with that.
Jane Louise Mixer, a 23-year-old University of Michigan law student, vanished after asking for a ride on a college bulletin board. She was headed to her hometown in Muskegon to share the news of her engagement and plans to move to New York City with her family. The next day, her clothed body was discovered on a grave in Denton Cemetery in Van Buren Township, covered with her raincoat, and with a copy of the novel Catch-22 next to her. She had been shot twice in the head. The police launched an investigation right away, but it would take them several decades to uncover the truth. What exactly happened to Jane on her way back home? Who was behind Jane's tragic fate? Van Buren Township, located in Wayne County, Michigan, is a charter township with a strategic position situated between Detroit Metropolitan and Willow Run airports. This prime location makes it an attractive spot for both business ventures and family living. Notable entities like USA Jet Airlines, with its headquarters at Willow Run Airport, contribute to the township's economic vitality. Additionally, Van Buren Township serves as the home base for auto parts manufacturer Visteon. According to the 2020 census, the township's population stood at 30,375 residents. However, it's crucial to be aware of the city's crime statistics. Your chance of becoming a victim of any type of crime in Van Buren Township is 1 in 23. And it was here that the tragic story of Jane Louise Mixer unfolded. So let's travel to Muskegon, where it all began. Jane Louise Mixer was born on February 23, 1946, in Muskegon, Michigan. She grew up with her older sister Barbara and her parents, Dan and Marion Mixer. People who knew Jane remembered her as a thoughtful and serious person who wasn't afraid to speak her mind. She was intelligent and independent, always paving her own way. Maggie Nelson, Jane's niece, shared her admiration for her aunt, saying, "Jane was many things I wanted to be: driven, disobedient, brilliant, independent." Fueled by her desire to make a difference, Jane headed to the University of Michigan after she graduated high school, sometime in the 1960s. College was just another stepping stone on her mission to change the world. 1969 was full of promise for 23-year-old Jane. She was breaking barriers at law school, being one of only 37 women out of 420 students. Passionate about politics and fighting for civil rights, she was paving her own path. On top of that, she was newly engaged to Phil Weitzman, an economics professor who shared her passion for activism. They had been dating for over a year. But there was a problem. Her parents weren't exactly thrilled with the whole relationship. Her father disapproved of Phil, mainly due to his Jewish faith and liberal views, which he suspected influenced Jane's involvement in campus protests. To make things more complicated, Phil had just landed a job at New York University, meaning a move from Michigan to New York. Jane wanted to break the news gently, planning to tell her parents alone before Phil joined her for spring break back in their hometown of Muskegon. But what should have been a joyous celebration of Jane's engagement took a tragic turn. Back then, hitchhiking was common, fueled by a sense of trust and a desire to break free from restrictions. While Jane wasn't about jumping in a car with any random person, she did use a popular ride board system at the university. The ride board system was a giant map covered in plastic, hanging in the student union basement. Below it, wooden boxes organized by destinations resembled a library card catalog. Jane wrote her name and phone number on a slip, sticking it in the Muskegon box. If another student was headed there, they would call and they'd share a ride. And someone did call. His name was David Johnson. On the cool spring evening, March 20th, 1969, Jane was in her dorm room at the Law Quadrangle with her fiancé, Phil. Spring had just officially begun the day before. After spending some time together, they soon shared a goodbye as Phil headed off for a tutoring session. Later, at 6:30 p.m., Jane reached for the phone, dialing the number of David Johnson, the student whom she had made the ride-sharing arrangement with. Suitcase packed and carrying a gift for her mother, Jane then stepped out of her dorm, never to be seen alive again. As the clock ticked past 10 p.m. that same night, worry gnawed at Jane's father back home in Muskegon. She had called earlier, promising to be home by 9:30 after finding a ride back. By 11 p.m., anxiety turned to panic. Dan Mixer jumped in his car and scoured the highway towards Ann Arbor, searching through the night. He came up empty-handed. At midnight, Dan called Phil, Jane's fiancé. Phil revealed he hadn't seen the driver, but he figured the ride worked out since Jane hadn't answered his 7 p.m. call at the dorm. Dan's hope dwindled further. 4 p.m. arrived and Jane remained missing. Phil, now deeply worried, headed for her dorm room. It was still dark as he drove by. At 8 a.m., Dan called to let him know that he had filed a missing persons report to the police. Back at the dorm, Phil managed to get a key and searched her room, finding nothing out of the ordinary. But what they didn't know then was a chilling truth. Jane's journey had ended far sooner than anyone imagined. Instead of heading west towards Muskegon, her intended destination 172 miles away, she had somehow ended up traveling just 14 miles east in the opposite direction. Friday morning, March 21st, 1969. The day dawned in Van Buren Township, about 14 miles from the University of Michigan. Nancy Groh, a housewife, was jolted awake by her 13-year-old son, who was running late for the school bus. As she scrambled to get him ready, her son pointed out a department store bag he found outside. Inside the bag, Nancy discovered a curious mix. A gift-wrapped package with a card, law school papers and folders, and fuzzy purple slippers. Curiosity burning, Nancy unfolded the card. It read, "Dearest Mom, sorry I'm late for your birthday, but in 100 years you'll never know the difference. I love you, Janie." The simple message, the unexpected slippers, and the legal documents were all confusing. Who did it belong to? She had no idea. Little did Nancy know she was about to discover a tragic truth. The abandoned bag and its strange contents filled her with a chilling unease and she was suddenly worried about her son walking to the bus alone. So she decided to drive him herself to school. As she drove past Denton Cemetery, a flash of yellow caught her eye near the entrance. Drawing closer, her blood turned to ice. A body lay sprawled near a headstone, partially covered. Panic surged through her, and with trembling hands, she steered the car towards her sister's house. On arriving there, she made a call to the police about her discovery. At around 10:30 a.m., the Ypsilanti police, led now by retired Detective Donald Bennett, arrived at Denton Cemetery, situated at the end of a gravel road. There, they discovered Jane Mixer's lifeless body just inside the chain-link fence enclosing the cemetery. Her remains were covered with a raincoat, and her personal belongings, including a suitcase, a paperback copy of Catch-22, and various clothing items on hangers, were arranged around her body and between her legs. Jane's posture was notable, with one arm resting above her head and the other shielding her eyes. The evident gunshot wounds on Jane's head indicated the cause of her death, yet the absence of blood and any signs of dragging suggested that the murder had not occurred at the cemetery. Additionally, a stocking had been tightly wound around her throat. She was dressed in a blue-gray jumper, with her underwear and nylons partially pulled down. The only traces left behind by the assailant were fresh tire tracks and the imprint of a man's shoe heel. These provided limited clues for the investigators at the scene. According to the findings of the Washtenaw County Medical Examiner Robert Hendricks, Jane's death resulted from 2 gunshot wounds to her head. The initial shot struck her in the left temple, followed by another to the lower left part of her skull. Additionally, she had been strangled with a cinnamon-colored stocking, although the evidence suggested that the strangulation occurred after she died. While there were no signs of physical assault, Jane's partially unclad state raised suspicions that she may have been taken advantage of. Based on the medical examination, it was estimated that Jane was shot sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. with a .22 caliber gun. This time frame implied that she had been detained elsewhere for over 4 hours, considering the assumption that she was likely picked up around 6:30 p.m. The discovery of soap granules on her coat led investigators to speculate whether she had been confined in a laundry area of some kind during her captivity. News of Jane's death reached her parents quickly. They had to face the unimaginable task of identifying her body at the morgue in Ann Arbor. Unfortunately, word of the tragedy had also spread to the media, and reporters swarmed the morgue entrance. As police escorted Jane's parents outside, they were overwhelmed by a barrage of questions from reporters. An officer advised them not to answer, and they didn't. They said they'd keep reporters away from us, Dan Mixer said. It was such a tragic situation. It seemed like such a personal invasion of privacy. Following the discovery of Jane's body, the police launched an immediate investigation into her murder. They swiftly became aware of her planned rideshare with David Johnson. While searching Jane's room and the campus for clues, they stumbled upon 2 significant leads regarding the identity of the mystery driver. On Jane's dorm room desk, they found a checkmark next to the name David Johnson in a phone book, indicating a potential connection. Also in the basement of the law school library, they came across another phone book with the words Mixer and Muskegon written in the margins. Acting on this information, the police visited the fraternity where University of Michigan student David Johnson resided. Although David was not home, they interrogated other residents and discovered that he was a theater enthusiast who was actively involved in a play on the night of Jane's disappearance. When they finally got to speak with David, he adamantly denied ever offering Jane a ride. After thoroughly verifying David Johnson's alibi, The police cleared him of any involvement in Jane's murder. Following this, the investigators embarked on a thorough search for every individual named David Johnson residing in the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti vicinity, particularly focusing on those who possessed .22 caliber firearms. However, after thorough investigation, all of these individuals were eliminated as suspects. Due to less than favorable remarks about Phil Weitzman made by Jane's father, the police shifted their focus to Jane's fiancé. Despite facing intense questioning, Phil provided a solid alibi, leading to his exoneration from suspicion in Jane's murder case. As the police kept digging into Jane Mixer's murder, more killings occurred in the vicinity. This left them puzzled and alarmed. The case seemed to match a troubling trend. Jane Mixer became the third young woman to be found dead in the area within the last 2 years. By the end of July, the tally had risen to 7 victims, most of whom had suffered violent treatment before their deaths. As the bodies continued to pile up, the Mixer family withdrew from the spotlight, but the community demanded action. The killer seemed unstoppable back in 1969. It wasn't until the discovery of the 7th victim that the police finally caught a break in the case. The arrest that followed came as a shock. 30-year-old John Norman Collins, an education major at Eastern Michigan University, with no prior criminal records, was arrested on July 31, 1969, and he was charged with the murder of a young woman named Karen Sue Beineman.
Well, I always felt he was guilty of murdering Beineman. I mean, the evidence that they put forward in the trial was I thought was pretty good. It was pretty excellent. You got to remember back when they did Beineman, the big evidentiary item that convicted him was the hair analysis. They found those hairs on Beineman's body, and they were able to match them forensically, and that's the first case in the nation that had been done with that, so it was very, very groundbreaking stuff back then.
A witness came forward claiming to have seen Collins with Karen shortly before her death. Although many believed Collins to be responsible for all 7 murders, he was only tried and convicted for Beineman's murder. Despite maintaining his innocence, Collins received a life sentence on August 19, 1970. He was never formally accused of the other 6 killings. Nevertheless, the people of Michigan breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing that the perpetrator had been apprehended and the string of murders had come to an end. Despite John Norman Collins being convicted for one of the murders, the evidence from Jane Mixer's case remained stored among cold cases for many years. Many investigators felt unsettled by the notion that Collins was responsible for her death, as it didn't seem to align with the patterns of the other killings. It took over 30 years for any significant progress to happen in the case. Then, in 2001, cold case detective Eric Schroeder decided to take a closer look. He opened an evidence box containing items related to Jane's murder, including a blood-stained yellow and white striped towel used to wrap around her head after she was shot to control the bleeding. Among the contents were also pantyhose and other items that could potentially contain valuable DNA evidence.
This envelope contains the pantyhose that were on Jane Mixer's body at the time she was found.
DNA wasn't used in criminal convictions until 1986, nearly 20 years after Jane's murder. However, by 2001, when Schroeder reopened the cold case, DNA had become the cornerstone of criminal trials. Schroeder sent the evidence to the state crime lab in Lansing, Michigan, where DNA analyst Steve Milligan began his work. Milligan started by examining the items under a blacklight. On Jane's pantyhose, he noticed 4 visible spots that could potentially contain DNA, although they weren't blood or semen stains. These spots might have been sweat left by the killer when he moved Jane's body to the graveyard.
Light source in order to scan the item of evidence and see if anything stands out against the background. There were 4 areas on the nylon pantyhose from Jane Mixer. Visibly, you could see that there was a stain present in the mesh of the nylon.
After isolating the stains, Milligan determined that 3 of them came from the same male donor. Additionally, he analyzed a single blood spot found on Jane's hand at the crime scene, discovering a second male donor. When Milligan compared these DNA samples to John Norman Collins, the suspected killer, they didn't match. The analyst entered the DNA into CODES, the combined DNA index system. The blood spot produced a match revealing a new suspect, John Roules, a convicted murderer serving time for killing his mother. While such a discovery would typically be cause for celebration among cold case detectives, there was a major obstacle. John Roules was only 4 years old in 1969 at the time of Jane's death. He was also residing in Detroit, approximately 40 miles away from the crime scene. Despite the glaring inconsistencies, Schroeder proceeded to Bellamy Creek Prison in Ionia, Michigan, to speak with Roules. He soon discovered that Roules' upbringing had been far from ideal. His transient mother often left him alone, occasionally resorting to sedating him with cough syrup. During their conversation, Roules recounted a childhood memory where he claimed to have stumbled upon a gruesome scene involving 2 of his uncles in the garage. At the time, he had seen a body covered in blood in the back seat of a running car. Efforts were later made to locate one of these uncles, who was alive, but his DNA didn't match any of the DNA found at Jane's crime scene. In the early 2000s, it wasn't just the police who were focused on the murder of Jane Mixer. Maggie Nelson, the daughter of Barbara Nelson, Jane's sister, was in the midst of writing a book. The book was a unique blend of poetry, memoir, and true crime, all centered around the aunt she had never known. Despite Jane living and passing away before Maggie was born, her murder had a profound impact on Maggie, shaping her in various ways throughout her life. In 2004, just as Maggie was gearing up to release her memoir, Jane, a Murder, she received an unexpected call from Detective Schroeder, who informed her that the case was making progress. Maggie and her family were taken aback by the news. Despite knowing that the case had never been officially closed, they had resigned themselves to the belief that it would remain unresolved. Here's what they learned. A year after Detective Schroeder's interview with John Roules, he received another call from the state crime lab. The DNA found on Jane's pantyhose had produced a match. It belonged to a 62-year-old man named Gary Leiterman from Gobles, Michigan. Leiterman, a retired nurse who was married with 2 children, seemed an unlikely suspect. For over 2 months, Schroeder investigated Leiterman's background. He found that at the time of Jane's death, Leiterman was a 26-year-old man residing roughly 20 miles from Ann Arbor. He was unmarried and had spent 4 years serving in the Navy. While Leiterman didn't have a criminal record related to violent offenses, he had been arrested in 2001 for forging fake prescriptions. This incident stemmed from his struggle with addiction to painkillers following bouts of kidney stones. As part of his legal proceedings, he was required to undergo a treatment program, during which his DNA was entered into CODES. In 2004, Schroeder brought Gary Leiterman in for questioning. 3 hours into the interrogation, Schroeder dropped his bombshell. He told Leiterman that his DNA had been discovered on the body of murder victim Jane Mixer. Despite the incriminating evidence, Leiterman vehemently maintained his innocence, claiming that not only had he not murdered Jane Mixer, but he had never even met her.
I may have met this person in a chance encounter, but I don't remember her specifically. I don't remember the face. I can remember having on one or two occasions, a sexual encounter with women that I met at bars.
However, Schroederman saw Leiterman's DNA found on Jane's pantyhose as unmistakable proof of his involvement. Just before Thanksgiving 2004, Leiterman was taken into custody and held without bail. While searching Leiterman's home, detectives made a disturbing find. They found a Polaroid photo hidden in a bedside cabinet. The picture showed an unconscious teenage girl, partially undressed, and lying on Leiterman's bed. Upon investigation, police discovered that the girl was a 16-year-old South Korean exchange student who had been staying with the Leitermans. In a tearful testimony later on, the girl confessed that she had no recollection of the photo being taken. Leiterman maintained that he had simply stumbled upon the photo and placed it in the cabinet to discuss with his wife upon her return from a trip. He described the exchange student as unruly and believed that he and his wife needed to discuss how to address the situation regarding the photograph. Additionally, detectives discovered an unmarked vial containing a powdered mixture of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, and diazepam, the active ingredient in Valium, inside Leiterman's shaving kit. A toxicologist referred to this mixture as a knockout potion. In January 2005, a hearing was held to outline the state's case against Gary Leiterman. Maggie Nelson, along with her mother Barbara and her grandfather Dan Mixer, attended the proceedings. Maggie remembered how her grandfather was the first witness to testify. During the hearing, other evidence was presented, including testimony from a female co-worker of Leiterman's, who had accused him of inappropriate misconduct on a bus during a work trip. Additionally, a man who lived with Leiterman in the late 60s testified. He recounted how Leiterman had once shown him a vial of liquid and bragged that it could render a woman unconscious, and too much of it could even kill her. However, much of his testimony was later deemed inadmissible during the trial. In July 2005, Gary Leiterman stood trial for the 1969 murder of Jane Mixer. Prosecutor Steve Hiller's case followed a basic outline. Leiterman had contacted Jane in response to a ride request at the University of Michigan, using the alias David Johnson to conceal his true identity. Leiterman then picked up Jane in front of her dorm a little after 6:30 p.m. on March 20th. He drove her to an unknown location and held her there, possibly at gunpoint, for a period of time. It's believed that he may have attempted to take advantage of Jane, which she resisted. In response, he shot her twice in the head and strangled her before dragging her body into Denton Cemetery sometime after midnight on March 21, 1969. The primary evidence connecting Leiterman to Jane was the DNA samples discovered on the pantyhose. Further evidence included the phone book recovered from the University of Michigan building at the time of Jane's murder. This was the book that contained the handwritten words Mixer and Muskegon. Handwriting expert Thomas Riley compared these words with several writing samples from Leiterman. He concluded that it was highly likely that Leiterman had written the words in the phone book. During the trial, a former roommate of Leiterman's testified that while living with him in the late 1960s and early 1970s, he had come across a newspaper covering the story of John Norman Collins, the suspected murderer of women in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. Additionally, the roommate mentioned that Leiterman owned a .22 revolver and had set up a firing range in his basement. State records confirm that Leiterman had indeed purchased a .22 caliber Ruger revolver in 1967, which he later reported stolen in 1987. Although Leiterman had reported the gun stolen, police discovered a revolver cylinder that a state police firearms expert determined to be consistent with the construction and design of a Ruger single-six .22 revolver cylinder. In court, a state police expert in ballistics stated that bullet fragments recovered from Jane's body during her autopsy were similar to those discovered in Leiterman's home in Van Buren County in 2004. The expert also mentioned that there are over 36 types of guns that could have fired such bullets. The DNA on Jane's pantyhose pointed heavily towards Gary Leiterman being the culprit, according to a DNA expert. The odds were mind-boggling. 171.7 trillion to 1 against anyone else leaving that trace. But Leiterman's lawyers had a different plan. They wanted to throw out the biggest piece of evidence the police had against him, the DNA on the pantyhose. They argued that the pantyhose couldn't be trusted, especially since blood found on Jane's hand belonged to a completely different person, a 4-year-old, who shouldn't have been anywhere near the crime scene. This raised serious questions about the lab's work and whether they might have messed up. During the court proceedings, it came to light that in 2002, genetic samples from Gary Leiterman, Jane Mixer, and John Rules were all being processed in the same laboratory. Even more surprising, bloody clothes from Rules' mother's murder were being tested on the same day an analyst was working on the blood droplet from Jane's hand in 1969. DNA evidence is usually pretty reliable, but this case was confusing. Prosecutors tried to explain the kid's DNA by suggesting Rules somehow saw the murder, but that didn't seem likely since nobody ever linked Leiterman to Rules. So the big question was, could the lab have accidentally mixed up the DNA samples? The defense attorney for Leiterman raised the possibility of lab contamination, which appeared to be a more plausible explanation. They argued that the lab might have accidentally mixed up samples, especially since the blood on Jane's hand had a child's DNA on it. If that could happen, what proof was there that the pantyhose DNA wasn't also a mix-up? This cast serious doubt on the prosecution's main piece of evidence. But that wasn't all. Other things didn't line up with Leiterman being the culprit. Witnesses saw cars near the crime scene that night, but none matched the cars Leiterman owned. Plus, none of his fingerprints matched any found at the crime scene. This cast even more doubt on the prosecution's case. The prosecution wasn't giving up without a fight. They brought in witnesses who talked about all the serious precautions the lab took to keep evidence separate and avoid mistakes. The supervisor, Jeffrey Nye, swore that there were no mix-ups. Interestingly, Leiterman chose not to defend himself in court. After 2 weeks of the trial and just hours of deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict. Leiterman was found guilty of first-degree murder. Jane's father, Dan Mixer, broke down in tears. Her sister, Barbara, described feeling numb. In a memoir about the trial, Maggie Nelson expressed lingering doubts about whether the convicted man was truly the killer. The verdict hit Leiterman and his family hard. During his sentencing, Leiterman finally spoke in court. He expressed sorrow for the Mixers' loss, saying, "It was probably an awful time in their lives back in 1969 to know that they lost their daughter and their sister. She appeared to be a lovely young lady, but I also want to say that I'm innocent of this crime." Despite his plea, Leiterman was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He never stopped fighting for his innocence, with appeals filed and supporters proclaiming their belief in his words. However, he was never granted a new trial. Eventually, Leiterman passed away in prison in 2019 at the age of 74. While the case is officially closed, questions and doubts still linger for some, leaving the story of Jane Mixer's murder with an unresolved feeling for many. As we close the chapter on the tragic case of Jane Mixer's murder and the trial of Gary Leiterman, we are left with lingering questions and emotions. Despite the verdict, doubts persist, echoing the uncertainty that has shrouded this case for decades. What if there was a mistake in the investigation, or a crucial piece of evidence overlooked? can we ever truly know the whole truth behind Jane's death?
From 1968 to 2000, we had no answers whatsoever. We just had a lot of suspicions and questions. In memory of Andrew L. Muns, Ensign, U.S. Navy, Vietnam, October 12, 1943, January 17, 1968.
On January 17, 1968, tragedy struck when 24-year-old Ensign Andrew Lee Muns vanished without a trace from the USS Cagapan, a refueling ship based at Subic Bay in the Philippines during the Vietnam War. The newly appointed payroll officer vanished out of thin air, and authorities discovered that $8,600 was missing from the ship's safe. As he had access to the safe, officials concluded that Muns had taken the money and disappeared.
He gave me a 3x5 card basically telling me that they are missing a dispersing officer and missing funds from the dispersing office safe. It brought some suspicion as to what happened to the $8,600 that was in the safe at that time. Was he a victim of foul play, or did he take the money and run?
The case eventually got closed. However, Muns' family always doubted this conclusion, insisting that it was out of character for him to steal and vanish.
My mother opened a letter one afternoon that said, "We're sorry to say this, but your son's missing." We knew immediately that something bad had happened to him and that he wasn't going to come back. Because we knew Andy and we knew he never would have left that ship on his own. He never would have deserted. That was totally against his character. So for us, it was more a matter of trying to get the Navy to believe that something bad really happened to him, that he didn't leave the ship voluntarily.
3 decades later, the case was reopened by NCIS Cold Case Squad, leading to an extraordinary turn of events. As we dig deeper into the case, let's explore 2 important questions. What crucial evidence was gathered to help identify the perpetrator? Furthermore, what might have been the motive behind this heinous act? Let's delve into the details of this case. Subic Bay is situated on Luzon's west coast in the Philippines, approximately 100 kilometers or 62 miles northwest of Manila Bay. It served as a vital naval base and staging area for the United States during the Vietnam War. The USS Cagapan was a refueling ship that was stationed at Subic Bay. This naval fleet played a crucial role in supporting U.S. military activities in the region throughout the Vietnam War. Now, numerous sailors went missing during the Vietnam War, primarily due to the hazardous and challenging conditions of naval operations in the conflict, and Subic Bay was no different. Among those missing was Ensign Andrew Lee Muns. Andrew Lee Muns was born on October 12, 1943, in Mount Lebanon, Pittsburgh, Allegheny County in Pennsylvania. Although details about his parents remain unknown, he had a beloved sister named Mary Lou Taylor, and 2 brothers, Skip and Doug. Muns grew up in Mount Lebanon and spent most of his early years in that wonderful community. He was a popular boy as he went through Mount Lebanon school system, from kindergarten to 10th grade. In 10th grade, he and his family moved to Upper Montclair. Throughout his time in Mount Lebanon, Muns had close friends who accompanied him from playing in the dirt behind Lincoln Grade School to becoming a handsome and mature high school sophomore. These friends were there for all of Andy's first experiences, from trying out sports to driving a car and going on his first date. After completing his schooling, Muns attended the senior high school in his hometown before joining Gettysburg College upon graduation. During this period, his family relocated to Upper Montclair, New Jersey. Motivated by a deep-seated desire to enlist in the military, Muns achieved his goal during the height of the Vietnam War, following graduation from college. Opting for a career as a sailor, he became the new payroll officer on the USS Cagapan, a refueling ship stationed at Subic Bay in the Philippines. Muns' commitment to military service had been evident from a young age, shaping his journey from Pennsylvania to New Jersey, and ultimately to his role on the USS Cagapan. Aware of the risks associated with the wartime job, Muns embraced his role, not foreseeing what fate had in store for him. On the cold night of January 17, 1968, tragedy struck when Muns mysteriously disappeared from the USS Cagapan. He had recently taken on the role of paymaster on the ship, which was stationed at Subic Bay in the Philippines. The crew was taken by surprise as Muns vanished without a trace, leaving everyone on board in a state of confusion about the circumstances surrounding his sudden and unexplained absence. Special Agent Raymond McGady of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS, was quickly informed about this scenario. Another huge issue was that $8,600 was also missing from the dispersing office safe. Muns was last seen alive above deck, heading to his office around 2 a.m. Authorities attributed the missing funds to Muns, given his role as paymaster with access to the money. They checked the embassies across Southeast Asia, including Hong Kong, Kaohsiung in Taipei, and Manila, but all efforts to locate Muns proved unsuccessful.
I do know that during the interview, there were some things in the interview that didn't feel right. He suggested that Ensign Muns might have gone scuba diving and was gone for that reason. It did seem ridiculous that Ensign Muns at the middle of the night would go scuba diving. First of all, it would be unsafe. Secondly, he couldn't see anything. And it seemed like it was probably some excuse to offer an explanation for him not being aboard the ship.
The Navy eventually labeled him as a deserter and closed the investigation in 1968. A letter was sent to Muns' family about his disappearance. Muns' disappearance was reported, and the unsettling information that $8,600 had also vanished left the family with a feeling that something terrible had happened. The family vehemently disagreed with the government's position that Muns may have stolen the funds. They said stealing and running away was completely out of character for him. According to his family, he was a friendly and daring young man who would never commit such a serious offense. For 8 long years, the Muns family endured increasing agony, compounded by the death of Muns' father from a heart attack. In 1976, the family finally requested Muns to be declared legally deceased, prompting a request for a memorial service and burial at Arlington National Cemetery. The Navy, citing Muns' deserter classification, denied the request, reserving the honor for those honorably discharged. The family, particularly Muns' sister Mary, couldn't accept the idea that her brother would be remembered dishonorably forever. Unconvinced by the official account, she embarked on a quest for truth. For that, she turned to the internet for assistance, posting a plea on a Vietnam Veterans Bulletin board in the mid-1990s.
He was officially labeled a deserter. There was an FBI form, a deserter document, sent to the FBI and to all the police in New Jersey and Pennsylvania where he lived. And so they were actually looking for him in regards to a larceny.
A former officer, Tim Rosaire, responded to the plea and agreed with Mary that it was highly unlikely that Muns would steal the money and disappear. Further research by Muns' sister revealed that despite the theft, there still remained a lump sum amount of $51,000 in the Cacapon ship's safe after his disappearance. The disparity of Muns taking only $8,600 raised doubts about the official narrative, further fueling the family's determination to uncover the truth surrounding Muns' perplexing disappearance. 30 years after his disappearance, in 1998, the case was reopened by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, Cold Case Unit. During interviews with former crew members of the USS Cacapon, where Muns served, it became apparent that many believed foul play was involved, challenging the initial belief that Muns had deserted his station and left on his own volition. This is when a potential suspect, by the name of Michael Edward LeBrun, who served as a petty officer alongside Muns in 1968, emerged during the reinvestigation. LeBrun was among the first to suggest that Muns had stolen money during the initial inquiry. During the initial investigation, he also mentioned that Muns might have gone scuba diving in the middle of the night, which felt highly improbable. Working in the dispersing office with Muns, LeBrun had access to the ship's safe as well. The NCIS called up LeBrun for interviews and conducted 4 interviews in the fall of 1999. During these sessions, LeBrun cooperated, answering questions voluntarily while receiving Miranda warnings on 3 occasions. In an interview on November 20th, 1999, LeBrun admitted to the agents that he believed he might have been involved in Muns' death and disappearance. He also mentioned repressed memories and asked for assistance in finding a therapist to help recover those memories. After the initial interviews, there was minimal contact with LeBrun for about 10 months as NCIS agents pursued other leads. However, by September 2000, LeBrun had become the primary suspect, prompting NCIS agents to re-interview him. On September 21, 2000, NCIS Special Agent Early and Corporal Hunter from the Missouri Highway Patrol unexpectedly showed up at LeBrun's workplace. Hunter informed LeBrun that they were conducting an investigation and asked him to accompany them to the Missouri Highway Patrol office for an interview. Despite not disclosing the investigation's subject, LeBrun agreed, thinking it might involve criminal allegations against his employer. Riding in an unmarked patrol car, LeBrun was not restrained, and the officers assured him he was free to leave or terminate the interview at any time. They took LeBrun to a prepared interview room adorned with enlarged photographs from his life. NCIS agents Early and Hunter identified themselves and initiated the interview, without reciting Miranda warnings, a deliberate decision according to the district court later on. Agent Early justified this by asserting it wasn't a custodial situation. Despite the absence of Miranda warnings, LeBrun testified at the suppression hearing that he understood his Miranda rights during the interview. He believed he was not in custody and could leave at any time. The government acknowledges the use of psychological tactics during the interview to elicit a confession. They did the same with LeBrun, labeling him as the prime suspect in Muns' death, and warning about the potential negative impact on his family and finances. Importantly, no shouting or physical force was employed by the agents at any point.
All right, I know you're responsible for Ensign Muns. Yeah, I know that. We can show that. The only issue is did it happen in a split second and that you planned out?
So premeditation, or was it spontaneous? That's the one question. Quite frankly, I think it's premeditation. There's a statute of limitations regarding spontaneous act.
I thought there was no statute of limitations on homicide.
It depends on how the act was completed.
I never intended to kill anybody. I never have planned to kill anybody.
Okay.
I've never premeditated to kill anybody.
But it happened with Andy Muns. Isn't that right?
I'm here to tell you there was no premeditation.
All right.
It was spontaneous.
Okay.
In a surprising turn of events, LeBrun confessed to the crime, approximately 33 minutes into the questioning.
Well, once LeBrun thought he wasn't going to be prosecuted because he committed what he perceived was a manslaughter, he decided to go ahead and confess.
He revealed that he was the one robbing the safe when Muns unexpectedly entered the dispersing office.
Andy Muns saw him do that, and Andy Muns said, okay, now I've got you, you're on report. And that's when that intent of premeditation came in, right then. It only takes seconds to form intent. And that's when he knew he had to kill him or go to the brig. And that's what he told us.
LeBrun admitted to rushing Muns, strangling him, and violently smashing his head against the deck. At the agent's encouragement, LeBrun stated that he physically reenacted the robbery and attack. He gave all the additional details on how he disposed of Muns' body and the stolen money.
What are you doing?
Say, what are you doing?
And I just
All right, show him how you grab him, please. How'd you grab him?
grab it.
What does he do?
He grabs back.
Where do I grab him?
I don't know, you just grab.
Grab.
And then I just kind of like, we can't, no, you can't, I'm blurred. I can't do this. I can't see this. You can't tell anybody. I don't recall exactly what I'm saying. I'm just panicked. He's struggling. He's kicking. He's pushing. But
Okay, well, what stops him from doing that?
I'm stronger than he is.
Right.
Kill him. Beast. What am I gonna do? My first thought was I gotta get rid of this body, throw it over the side. I went out to the well deck and thought, must be a splash. It'll float. I'm deep here. I've got this. What am I gonna do?
LeBrun confessed to dumping them in a tank of caustic fuel oil to eliminate evidence.
And then he had to figure out what to do with the body and what to do with the money. Why throw away $8,600? Why not just keep it? Well, LeBrun already starting to figure out how I need to cover this crime up. Was thinking about latent impressions. Hey, my fingerprints are on this money. I need to get rid of this money.
Following the admission of his guilt, agents Early and Hunter asked LeBrun if he wanted to apologize to Muns' sister, Mary Lou Taylor, who had flown in from Milwaukee to assist in the interrogation.
I've come to realize that I was responsible for Andy's death. And I'm sorry to you for that. It's something that I haven't even been willing to face for the last 30-some years. And I don't know what else to say. It's just, I'm so sorry.
I'm glad to be able to lay this to rest.
Oh God, I'm glad it's for you, and it's partially laid to rest for me, but it's not done yet.
LeBrun expressed a willingness to apologize.
It was awkward for me because it felt like I was supposed to say, there, that's okay. But it's not okay. He killed my brother. And so just confessing isn't okay. It was hard to say, oh yeah, I understand. I didn't understand. He killed my brother because he was stealing money and he got caught. I don't understand that. At the end, when we were leaving, and he said, may I give you a hug? I forget his exact words, but it was something like, can I hug you, or may I give you a hug? I was totally taken aback, and I certainly wasn't ready to say, oh, sure.
I'm sorry. Can I give you a hug? Is that okay?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine. I mean,
Taylor, accompanied by Agent Billington, posing as Muns' brother, allegedly stricken with cancer, entered the interview room. LeBrun acknowledged his responsibility for Muns' death and offered his apology. After concluding their questioning, LeBrun permitted a search of his house. Surprisingly, despite the confession, LeBrun was not arrested that day. LeBrun was arrested a few days after the incident and charged with felony murder in March of 2001. Later, he appealed his trial, arguing that he wasn't informed of his Miranda rights before confessing to the murder of Muns. Over the next 4.5 years, there were ongoing efforts to exclude his confession from evidence, with it being disallowed and then reinstated multiple times. In September 2005, just before the start of his trial's jury selection, LeBrun acknowledged the truth of his confession and pleaded guilty to manslaughter in connection with Muns' case. As a result, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. This turn of events concluded a prolonged legal process surrounding the confession and marked the resolution of the case, with LeBrun accepting responsibility for his actions. After LeBrun confessed to his crimes, Muns received full military honors at a memorial service held in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia in June of 2001. A ceremonial casket adorned with an American flag symbolized the occasion, marking the end of Muns being classified as a deserter. A headstone was erected at the burial grounds in his memory, commemorating his service and bringing closure to the tragic chapter. Many newspapers and news bulletins announced Muns' murder and his innocence. The announcement of his murder was a profound shock and sadness for everyone who knew him. After he relocated, most of his friends from Mount Lebanon lost touch with him. One friend depicts a story that in 2002, while reading the local newspaper, a headline caught his attention about a Navy ensign whose reputation was cleared after a murder. A sense of dread overcame him, as if he instinctively knew it was Muns. Informing Muns' remaining Mount Lebanon friends elicited similar reactions. He was remembered as one of the good guys, with a promising life ahead of him. As we wrap up the heartbreaking tale of Andrew Muns, we'd like to pose 2 important questions. Do you believe that a 4-year sentence was sufficient for the crimes committed by LeBrun? And considering LeBrun's confession and the legal proceedings, do you believe the absence of Miranda warnings during the interview impacted the reliability of the confession? For more than 30 years, detectives in Kansas City have been trying to solve the upsetting case revolving around a girl named Fawn Cox. On June 26, 1989, something really awful happened at her home. While everyone else in the house was sleeping, someone broke in, hurt Fawn, and did something terrible to her. None of her family members heard anything suspicious that night. Even though the police tried really hard, they couldn't crack the case back then. They initially believed that the suspects were members of a local gang. However, given that the neighborhood had a high crime activity, including drug abuse and prostitution, it looked as though finding the real killer was an uphill task. As per a news report at one point, virtually everyone in the neighborhood seemed a suspect. After years of skepticism, it finally began to seem that the perpetrator could have been someone among her own near and dear ones. How could someone commit such a heinous act while the rest of her family slept in the same house? How did the killer manage to escape the law and police for so long? Kansas City, Missouri, a city that resonates with both vibrant traditions and hidden mysteries. Yes, from the historic River Market to the lively 18th and Vine District and the timeless Country Club Plaza, the city's iconic landmarks paint a portrait of cultural richness. In the very heart of Kansas City, where the Missouri and Kansas rivers converge, we navigate through the pages of history intertwined with crime. The city's bowl-shaped topography, surrounded by glacier-carved limestone and bedrock cliffs, serves as a silent witness to the ebb and flow of both life and inexplicable events. The city has high crime activity, and it is 2 times higher than the average crime rate. Your chance of being a victim in the city is 1 in 50. That was one of the reasons why the police struggled a great deal in shortlisting the suspects in the Fawn Marie killer case. Fawn Marie Cox, born on March 24, 1973 in Kansas City, Missouri, was the oldest of 3 siblings, Felisa and Amber being her sisters. Growing up on East 9th Street, she helped take care of her younger siblings, while simultaneously finding time for roller skating, swimming, and camping with her grandparents. A devoted churchgoer at the Sheffield Assembly of God Church, Fawn, despite her family's financial struggles, was determined to make the most of her life. In the summer of 1989, at 16, she got a part-time job as a cashier at the Worlds of Fun amusement park and worked long hours to support her family. After selling tickets until 11 p.m., she'd come home to East 9th Street, balancing the challenges of being a teenager who shouldered responsibilities beyond her years. She would spend her entire summer doing odd jobs to earn, and the family members all must have been proud of the young lady she was growing into. The glory didn't last long. While being a junior at Northeast High School, her bright future was cut short by the following ghastly incident. On July 26, 1989, after completing her shift at the amusement park, her mother Beverly and sister Felisa picked her up as it would have taken her longer to reach home on her own. Exhausted after her long day at work, Fawn went straight to bed, unaware that it would be her last night at home. Typically, her sisters, Felisa and Amber, shared rooms adjacent to hers, but that night, she found herself alone on the 2nd floor. Amber was babysitting for a family friend, and on that steamy summer night, Felisa also opted to sleep downstairs as it was much cooler. The only functioning air conditioner was downstairs, where their parents also slept. As Fawn peacefully slept, the events of that fateful night took a darker turn. Next day morning, at 9:30 a.m., the family awoke to the blaring alarm clock in Fawn's room, which she hadn't turned off. Since that was unusual, Felisa and Beverly went to her room to wake her up. Fawn laid lifeless on the bed, with a shirt around her neck, from which they deduced that she could have been strangled. She had no pulse, and it was clear that she had been lying in the blood, cold and lifeless, for quite some time. Although the ambulance was immediately called, it was too late. After examining the crime scene, the police concluded that she was abused and strangled to death like the family had figured. Despite the tragedy occurring in her own bedroom, no one in the house heard anything due to the old and incredibly loud air conditioner downstairs, which drowned out any other noise. Yet one particular behavior caught Felisa's attention. The family poodle, who usually kept calm, was acting anxious and had been barking, an unusual display for the well-behaved dog. While initially ascribed and dismissed as a natural reaction of the pregnant dog, in hindsight it became apparent that the poodle may have sensed something amiss during all the vain attempts to alert the family about the tragedy in Fawn's room. Following the discovery of Fawn Cox's lifeless body on the morning of July 27, 1989, the police initiated a comprehensive investigation to uncover the circumstances of her tragic death. The details of the crime scene included body fluid of the suspect and some items from the crime scene, which seemed to be missing, according to her family. The police found crucial remarks which suggested that the multiple suspects might have entered the house through the window that faced the backyard. This window, left open due to the lack of air conditioning on the second floor, became the focal point for the investigators. Even Amber, Fawn's sister, believed that several people had entered the house and hidden closets before Fawn got home after her shift that night. They would have come out of their hiding places after Fawn was fast asleep. At least Amber thought that. The crime scene suggested a calculated and deliberate act, as the perpetrators seemed well acquainted with the house's layout and the family's routines. An old trailer parked near the house provided them a possible means for reaching the second-story window. And there were witnesses who reported seeing several individuals climbing up on a truck parked behind her home. Further clues in Fawn's bedroom added complexity to the investigation. Short hairs, bloodstains, and traces of semen on her bedsheet were recovered and were submitted to the lab for analysis. The missing items from the house were a Nintendo game console, 2 radios, and a stereo, which raised questions about the motive behind the intrusion. By now, burglary was also added to the possible motive list. Complicating matters further, several items were found on the ground in front of the house, as if the burglars had discarded them there for unknown reasons. Detectives also discovered that various items had been removed from a closet in an adjoining room on the second floor, indicating that the perpetrators may have been hiding there while waiting for the right moment to strike. During the initial phase of the investigation, Detective Benjamin Caldwell emerged as a crucial part, recognizing the complexity of the case. His perspective mainly included the unsettling notion that multiple assailants might have been involved. Moreover, these individuals possessed a great knowledge of the house. This understanding was beyond merely navigating the backyard to reach the second floor in the cover of darkness. Rather, it involved an intricate awareness of the room layouts. The chilling realization meant that someone had been meticulously observing the family, patiently awaiting the opportune moment to attack. As the investigation went on, the detectives faced a daunting task. Another woman, Tracy Lynn Ramsey, also had gone missing from the same area on October 30th, 1984. She was a 20-year-old and a mother of 2. People from the area believed these 2 cases could be of similar nature since it wasn't a safe neighborhood. Now, initial attempts to gather information from witnesses, including neighbors, friends, and relatives, yielded leads which were open to many doubts. The killers seemed to have vanished without a trace. Despite the frustration and dead ends, the detectives pressed on, determined to unearth the truth. After a month of setbacks, a breakthrough finally emerged. A witness came forward, pointing the police towards 3 teenage suspects, one of whom shared a class with Fawn. This promising lead sparked renewed spirit in the investigation, as the witness provided crucial details not disclosed to the public by the police. The 9th Street Dog Gang evolved as a significant element, with 3 members of this local gang, Christopher Yates, Timothy Roberts, and Leonard Crucius, being suspected and charged in the case. Christopher Yates was charged with second-degree murder in August of 1989. Timothy Roberts, also 18 years old, faced charges of first-degree murder, and 18-year-old Leonard Crucius was charged with burglary in December of 1989. The leads that led to their arrests initially seemed promising. Stolen items from Fawn's room were found in one of the suspects' homes, and the evidence was strong enough to file murder charges against them. However, the investigation took an unexpected turn when the main witness suddenly recanted and stopped cooperating with the police. This setback, coupled with restrictions in DNA forensics during the 1980s, created significant hurdles for the detectives. The complexity of the case intensified as the police struggled to bring any definite suspects finally to a trial. In the early 2000s, the police decided to reopen the investigation, hoping that advancements in DNA analysis could provide new leads. The police, armed with optimism in the potential breakthroughs offered by scientific progress, uploaded the DNA samples from the crime scene to the National DNA Database, or CODES. The goal was clear: to identify the elusive killer whose identity had remained concealed for more than a decade by then. Back then, confirming whether the samples of blood and semen found at the scene were those of the gang members was difficult. It didn't stand a chance as solid evidence. At the time, the possibility of the 3 teenagers being the killers could not be ruled out as well. The results were indeed vague. The process of uploading DNA samples to CODES was a significant step forward in forensic science. The investigators hoped that the advancements would help solve the mysteries surrounding Fawn's murder. The anticipation was substantial, with law enforcement eagerly awaiting any potential matches that would lead them to the perpetrator. But despite the technological progress and high expectations, the end results were disheartening. No matches were found for Fawn's killer. The family, however, was determined and posted billboards with Fawn's picture and asked the public to share any information they might have known about the case. Amber also expressed in an interview that she had to spend quite some time at the hospital, as she was fighting with the trauma and PTSD of having lost her loved one. Amber always looked up to Fawn with respect, and she was her guide, friend, and protector. However, the narrative in Fawn Cox's murder investigation took an unexpected turn in 2018, when her family initiated a fundraiser. The objective was clear: to raise funds to cover the costs of new DNA testing, a potential avenue to break the deadlock in the case. The family's resilience and commitment to unveil the truth was the solid reason why the poor soul found justice in the end. The family's efforts gained momentum, drawing attention from the media and the true crime community. The family's plea for support struck a chord with those who recognized the enduring impact of unsolved crimes on the lives of victims' families. The family then turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a leading company in DNA analysis known for its breakthroughs in solving cold cases. The lab's expertise in extracting valuable information from small genetic samples and creating approximate portraits of individuals based on DNA offered a glimmer of hope in Fawn's case. In the year 2020, a remarkable breakthrough occurred in the decades-old investigation. The development came in the form of advanced genetic genealogy techniques, akin to those instrumental in solving the notorious Golden State Killer case. Criminal genetic genealogy now involves analyzing crime scene DNA and creating a suspect's genetic profile. This profile is then compared to public genealogy databases, identifying relatives who share DNA. Investigators build family trees, narrowing down suspects. After the faulty imprisonment of the 3 teenagers, and Fawn's family grappling with decades of trauma and grieving her loss, a shocking finding was made regarding the ghastly incidents of that fateful night in 1989. The 3 teenagers did rob the house. However, the one who abused and killed the young girl was a fox who disguised himself as a sheep. The killer had been hiding himself safely all these years. It was Fawn's cousin, Donald Cox Jr., who was 21 years old when he did this heinous act. The family broke down to pieces after finding out about the killer. They didn't even imagine in their wildest dreams that a family member was capable of doing something so terrible to Fawn. Donald had an extensive criminal record and was regularly put behind bars for burglary and drug abuse. However, back in the day, DNA collection of the criminals was not saved for the records. If that was the case, this case would have found closure in no time. Donald Pax Jr., or Donnie, was the nephew of John Cox, Fawn's father. John was quite close to his brother Donald Sr., and Donnie was Donald Sr.'s son. Donnie had a brother and a sister, and his parents got separated when he was young. Eventually, he and his siblings kept being in and out of foster care for quite a long time. Donnie had been released from prison for burglary just days before Fawn's murder. Hence, it still remained a mystery as to why the police did not suspect him in the first place. One of Donnie's friends said on Facebook that he could not believe that Donnie would commit such a crime, and that he respected all the ladies, especially those within the family. Felisa said on Facebook that she was not surprised with Donnie being the accused, as Donnie had continuously molested the sisters as girls, and they used to call him a monster. It's heartbreaking that the cold-blooded murderer was not given the opportunity to face his crimes. Donald had passed away on July 30th, 2006, due to a drug overdose. Donald was only 21 when Fawn died, and he had a history of getting into trouble with the law for violations like burglary and drugs. His involvement in Fawn's murder showed how untreated trauma and addiction could lead to awful consequences. Donald's death in 2006 closed a chapter, but it opened a new question. What about the 3 original suspects from the local gang who were originally suspected to have been at the house that night? They had been under investigation for years. Now, with the knowledge that Donald knew the house so well, the link between the suspects and the crime became clear. Even though the police decided to close the case and not charge the 3 men, it didn't sit well with some in the community. Felisa, Fawn's sister, didn't think getting confessions from the original suspects was no longer necessary. In her eyes, they already paid a price with how the community treated them. It was known that Donnie was 4 to 5 years older than the 3 guys who had got arrested, and Felisa did not believe that Donnie had connections with them. She was not interested in charging the 3 young men anymore, as it was too late. She wanted to apologize to those men as she felt that their initial arrests could have been detrimental to their lives thereafter. Donald lived for 17 years without facing legal consequences, eventually succumbing to his addiction. The resolution brought both relief and sadness for the Cox family, who endured decades of pain. Fawn Cox's tragic story reminds us that justice might take a long time, but it can still come. The mix of advances in DNA analysis and the family's determination to find the truth shows how criminal investigations are always evolving. The Cox family's long journey is a strong reminder of the strength of those who won't let their loved ones be forgotten. As we wrap up the sad story of Fawn Cox's murder, with the discovery that Fawn's cousin Donald Cox was the one behind it all, brought a mix of relief and more questions for her family after 30 years of an unsolved crime and elusive suspects. Donald Cox's death due to drug overdose was initially marked as suspicious. Hence, a blood sample had been drawn at the time of his death. That blood sample, collected because Donald could have been a probable victim, was later used to match with the DNA of Fawn's killer. This DNA evidence not only proved Donald was behind Fawn's death, but also showcased the progress in forensic and genetic genealogy technologies. Closing one part of the story with Donald identified as the culprit opened another, raising questions about the original 3 suspects. It also would seem that Donald might have coaxed them into doing the burglary. Despite this, law enforcement decided not to press charges against them. Law enforcement's choice not to pursue charges against the original suspects had led to having mixed feelings within the community. Donald's tragic life ended without facing legal consequences for Fawn's murder. The man had acted like a person genuinely sorry about the loss of Fawn and grieving in front of the community. For 17 years, he lived a life without facing his crime and betrayed and fooled the entire family until his death. In Fawn Cox's sad story, the conclusion is a sharp reminder of the tough road to justice and the power of technology in solving old cases.
Right now, they're doing interviews and reviewing evidence and files about the stabbing of Alice Haynsworth Ryan.
It was looked to be a burglary. We don't believe it was a burglary.
She died at her home near Cleveland Park in 1988.
On October 8, 1988, a tragic event unfolded at 16 Woodland Way in Greenville, South Carolina. Alice Haynsworth Ryan, a lung cancer patient who had just returned from a 3-day chemotherapy session, was discovered lifeless in her kitchen. She had suffered multiple stab wounds. The grim discovery was made by her daughter, Catherine Stribling, who noticed a broken window pane near the back door, signaling something was amiss. This heart-wrenching scene raised many questions. Who could have committed such a heinous act? What motive lay behind this inhumane crime? Greenville, South Carolina, with a population of over 70,000 at the 2020 census, is a vibrant city known for its rich history and flourishing art scene. It's a place where historic charm meets modern living, boasting numerous recreational and historic sites. The community, friendly and diverse, contributes to a lively and welcoming atmosphere. Greenville is distinguished by its balance of urban conveniences and natural beauty, making it an appealing destination for residents and visitors alike. Despite its many positives, like any city, Greenville faces challenges, including crime with a rate of 81.53%, higher than the national average. The resolution of the Alice Haynsworth Ryan cold case is a reminder of the city's ongoing efforts to address these issues. Born into a notable family on January 24, 1908, Alice Haynsworth Ryan grew up in a world of privilege and prominence in Greenville. Her father, Harry J. Haynsworth, and mother, Rhoda Livingston Haynsworth, raised her on Main Street, a setting that shaped her life deeply. Alice's connections were extensive. She was the sister of mill owner H.J. Haynsworth Jr. and related to prominent figures like Judge Clement Haynsworth and Greenville's mayor, Knox White. At the age of 80, Alice was a widow, her husband Joseph Murray Ryan having passed away in 1950, when she was just 42 years old. This loss left her to navigate much of her life alone. Yet she remained a central figure in Greenville society. Her life story was intertwined with the city's history, having spent her entire married life in the large Woodland Way home near Cleveland Park, the very place where her life was tragically cut short. Alice, a mother of 3, led a life marked by social engagements. She was a regular at cotillion events and alumna of Converse College, and a member of the Greenville Country Club. Despite her wealth and status, she led a simple home life. Surprisingly, she chose not to install air conditioning in her home, a decision that sometimes worried her family, who were also concerned about her lack of security systems. Yet those who knew her described her as fearless. In late 1987, Alice faced a new challenge, a diagnosis of lung cancer following a bout with pneumonia. She fought this battle until her untimely death, undergoing chemotherapy and enduring the toll it took on her health. Her life, rich in connections and history, tragically ended in the place she had known as home for so long, leaving a community in shock and a family grappling with the immense loss. On that fateful Saturday, October 8, 1988, Greenville was graced with a clear sky, a stark contrast to the usual sultry haze of the southern summer. For 80-year-old Alice Ryan, this day marked a moment of relief. She was leaving St. Francis Hospital after a strenuous 2-night stay for her chemotherapy treatment. Little did anyone know it would be her last day. Catherine Stribling, Alice's 51-year-old daughter, had a routine plan that day. She dropped her mother off at home around 2 p.m. after the hospital visit, and then left to grab lunch for both of them. However, upon her return at 3:10 p.m., a disturbing sight awaited her. As she approached the back door of her mother's house, she noticed something alarming. The pane near the doorknob was shattered. Puzzled and perhaps a bit anxious, Catherine inserted her key and opened the door, not even checking if it was locked. The scene that unfolded before Catherine in the kitchen was horrifying and surreal. Her mother Alice lay motionless on the floor. The serene setting of their home was shattered, just like the window pane. Catherine's eyes were drawn to the white silk turban, now a few feet away from her mother, stained with blood and leaving Alice's bald head exposed, a silent testament to her battle with cancer. Further adding to the shock, Alice's brown trousers were undisturbed, but her pink turtleneck and brown sweater were disheveled, revealing multiple dark, ominous wounds on her abdomen. The peaceful morning had spiraled into a nightmare. The tranquility of a mother returning home after treatment was ferociously interrupted by an act of violence, leaving a family in grief and a community in shock. The discovery of Alice Haynsworth Ryan's body was not just a tragic moment for her family, but a jolting incident for the entire community of Greenville. It marked the beginning of a long, unsolved mystery, a cold case that would haunt the city for years to come. The discovery of Alice Haynsworth Ryan's body in her Greenville home set off a complex and intense investigation by local law enforcement. Immediately, the police arrived at the scene, delving into the details of this inhumane murder. The first significant clue emerged when a black and yellow-handled flathead screwdriver, believed to be the murder weapon, was found in a ravine near the location where a car also had been found abandoned. Intriguingly, the screwdriver bore no fingerprints, complicating the investigation. Additionally, a bloody dish towel matching others in Mrs. Ryan's pantry was discovered, adding another layer to the mystery. The autopsy report revealed grim details. Alice Ryan, already weakened by her chemotherapy treatments, showed no signs of defensive wounds. No hair or skin was found under her fingernails, indicating she hadn't fought back. She had succumbed to 4 fatal knife thrusts to her back and abdomen, but her body bore a total of 37 stab wounds. This level of violence left the community in shock and fear. The murder sent ripples of unease through the neighborhood. Residents previously feeling secure in their homes started taking extra precautions. Calls to burglar alarm companies spiked. People became more vigilant about strangers, and double-checking locked doors became a routine. A crucial eyewitness account came from a 16-year-old girl living half a mile from Mrs. Ryan's house. A student at Christ Church Episcopal School, she reported seeing a white car speeding backward down Mrs. Ryan's driveway around the time of the murder. She recognized the car in police custody as the one she had almost collided with. Although she could not provide a detailed description of the driver, she recollected having noted dark hair. The investigation into Alice Ryan's murder became one of the largest in Greenville's history. The Greenville Police Department, along with state law enforcement division agents and an FBI agent, worked tirelessly on the case. They created a detailed profile of the potential perpetrator and interviewed about 300 people, including roughly 60 potential suspects. The evidence gathered was extensive. 2 large cardboard boxes filled with incident reports, tape recordings, interview notes, and crime scene photos. The investigators were acutely aware of Alice Ryan's high-profile status. The widow of a millionaire textile executive and a member of one of Greenville's most prominent legal families. Alice's family also openly decided to give out a $10,000 reward to anyone who could provide the killer's name or any information aiding the case. Despite the scale of the investigation and the plethora of leads pursued, every avenue explored led to a dead end. The case eventually went cold for decades. Decades after the chilling murder of Alice Haynsworth Ryan, a breakthrough emerged in 2017, offering a glimmer of hope in a case that had long been shrouded in mystery. The persistence of investigators led them to re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes and advanced technology. Their diligence paid off when they discovered DNA evidence on one of the items originally collected from the crime scene. This crucial piece of evidence, belonging to an African-American man, had been preserved all these years, waiting for the advancements in forensic science to catch up. The investigators submitted this DNA sample to the Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODES. In November of 2017, the tireless efforts of the law enforcement team were rewarded. They received notification of a match in the CODES database to a DNA profile. This was the moment they had been waiting for, a significant lead in a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades. The DNA profile led them to a 50-year-old man residing in Americus, Georgia. Further investigations and DNA testing confirmed his identity as Brian Keith Muns. This discovery marked a pivotal turn in the investigation, transforming it from a cold case to a case with a tangible suspect. Born in 1968, Brian Keith Muns had a background that was largely unknown in terms of family details. However, his criminal record painted a troubling picture. In 1998, Muns faced charges for first-degree criminal conduct. He eventually pleaded guilty in 2001, leading to a period of imprisonment that lasted until May of 2007. Upon release, he was placed on probation, but this period of relative freedom was short-lived. Muns found himself back behind bars in August of 2008, after his community supervision was revoked. Released on probation again in May of 2009, his freedom was once more fleeting. He violated the terms of his release by failing to register as a offender, resulting in his community supervision being revoked yet again in July of 2009. Muns completed his sentence and was released in October of 2009. This pattern of incarceration and release, along with the serious nature of his offenses, underscores a troubled history.
All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm pleased to announce that we have made an arrest of the suspect in the murder of 80-year-old Alice Haynsworth Ryan in her Cleveland Park home on Woodland Way nearly 31 years ago. We know the time in between has been painful for the family, and we are elated to bring some closure for them and justice for Miss Ryan.
On May 6, 2019, the Greenville Police Department made a significant announcement. Brian Keith Muns, then 51 years old and residing in Americus, Georgia, was arrested in connection with the long unsolved murder of Alice Haynsworth Ryan. Greenville Police Chief Ken Miller revealed that Muns was actually taken into custody earlier on February 15th. However, this development was kept under wraps to allow for further investigations and interviews. Chief Miller explained the rationale behind the delayed announcement. Releasing information about Muns' arrest too soon could have jeopardized the investigation, potentially hindering the ability of detectives to corroborate witness statements and gather more information. Following his arrest, detectives conducted 30 additional interviews, which were crucial in piecing together the events surrounding Ryan's death. One of those interviews proved particularly revealing. An acquaintance of Muns provided detailed accounts of the crime, including how Muns entered Ryan's home, the nature of the injuries inflicted, and the sequence of events. This information was vital in filing additional charges against Muns. The arrest of Muns was the culmination of a painstaking 29-month reinvestigation involving the Cold Case Unit, active detectives, and a state law enforcement division agent. Chief Miller lauded the efforts and dedication of those involved, including solicitors who ensured the case was handled in a way conducive to successful prosecution. However, the case took another twist after Muns' arrest. He confessed to being in Ryan's car with Lamar Green, another individual on the day of the murder. Muns implicated Green as the one responsible for Ryan's death, claiming that Green tried to sell him the car afterward. Intriguingly, Lamar Green had been a suspect from the start, but was killed in an incident deemed justifiable homicide, thus closing his chapter in the investigation. Despite the initial charges, Muns ultimately pleaded guilty of failing to report the crime to law enforcement. In September of 2021, he was sentenced to 4 years with time already served, and the other charges against him were dropped. After years of uncertainty and grief, Alice Haynsworth Ryan's family finally received some form of closure in the case of her tragic death. Joe Ryan, one of Alice's children present at the police conference for his mother's case closure, had this to say.
We would like to thank everyone who has worked on this case for all these times and pride of being a dictator, Greenville Police Department, and keeping up of all safe. We've also been marked by the effect of whatever we have put forth. Thank you for Chief Miller for what he has done and for the growing of Greenville forward and doing such an outstanding job. Thank you all for everybody that is involved in this thing. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. It's a big, big thing out.
could more have been done to prevent such a tragedy? In what ways do you think the dedication of the duty-bound police officers impact the long-standing investigation of a high-profile socialite's victimization? In the fall of 1986, a twisted killer began terrorizing the state of Virginia. The horror started on October 9, 1986, as the murderer claimed his first two victims, two women, named Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. After managing to escape justice, the unidentified killer would strike again on September 19, 1987. This time, the unfortunate victims were David L. Knobling and Robin M. Edwards. With the authorities having no leads on the killer's identity or whereabouts, these murders would go unsolved for 36 years. But even after all that time, FBI Special Agent Brian Dugan made it his mission to answer two questions. How did this killer keep evading justice? And where is he right now? Also known as the Old Dominion State to its earliest residents, the state of Virginia is located between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic coast in the southeastern region of the United States. With almost 9 million residents living there in 2022, the state of Virginia is often said to be one of the best places to call home. Widely known to be one of the safest states in the U.S., Virginia was named the fourth lowest violent crime rate in the country in 2023. However, things took a drastic turn in the year 1986, as the once safe state of Virginia became a playground for one of the most disturbed and elusive killers in the United States. 20-year-old David Lee Knobling was born on January 31, 1967, to parents Carl and Judy Knobling in Newport News City, Virginia. David Knobling was a good and well-mannered boy growing up. He was raised with his little brother Michael in Virginia, and both boys had a nice childhood. In his early adolescent years, David lived in Hampton City and worked as a salesman for his father, Carl Knobling, who owned a landscaping business. The people who met David at the time often said that one of his most prized possessions was his pickup truck, a black Ford Ranger. The car became synonymous with him, as he went everywhere with it, and he took any opportunity to tell people how much he admired the car. During that same period, David had also fallen in love with his longtime girlfriend while working as a salesman for his father, and the couple were expecting a child together. In the later days of September 1987, the Knobling family was visited by one of David's cousins, and on September 19, 1987, David took his younger brother Michael and his cousin out in its truck. He drove them around Newport News, a nearby city in Virginia, and during that fateful outing, David met someone who would quickly become his new friend. That person was a 14-year-old girl named Robin Edwards. Robin Margaret Edwards was born on August 3, 1973, to parents Robert and Bonnie Edwards in Lexington Park, St. Mary's County, Maryland. Robin was the couple's second child, and she was raised with her elder sister Janet and her younger sister Pam, who came along 2 years after her birth in 1975. During the later years of her childhood, Robin was often described as a curious, energetic, and clever girl who wasn't afraid of anything. But even though she was a sharp-witted kid, numerous records show that Robin was a very troubled child. She suffered from numerous mental health and behavioral issues which often caused her to break down, and had run away from home on 2 occasions in the past. Robin's erratic and reckless behavior only grew worse once she became a teenager. Robin, who was in the 8th grade at the time, had to undergo numerous family counseling sessions. These therapy sessions later proved helpful as Robin showed good progress over the course of the family counseling program. Due to the great counseling progress, her family decided to reward her with a waterbed and a kitten. These supportive gifts were given to Robin just a few weeks before she'd met the then 20-year-old David Knobling while she was out and about in Newport News. Despite the 6-year age difference between David and Robin at the time of their meeting, the pair hit it off. After they'd talked for a while, David brought Robin along on the family outing with Michael and his cousin, as he took them around Newport in his truck. After spending the day together, he dropped Robin and his cousin off at their houses, before taking his brother to their mother's home. It was pretty late at that point, but the day wasn't over for David, as he and Robin had made late-night plans. Robin snuck out a few hours after she'd been dropped off, and she met up with David at an arcade. The arcade was just a rendezvous point for the pair, as they both drove off to Ragged Island, a wildlife management area located in the Isle of Wight County, Virginia, to spend some time together. Neither David nor Robin gave any reason as to why they drove all the way to Ragged Island that night. Some Virginians believe David took the trip because he wanted to clear his head and take a short break from his growing responsibilities. Others say Robin, who had been showing progress in her counseling sessions, just wanted to go on a harmless but exciting adventure to the island. However, none of these theories were ever confirmed, because that was the last night David Knobling and Robin Edwards were ever seen alive. On September 19, 1987, the 20-year-old David Lee Knobling and the 14-year-old Robin Margaret Edwards went missing. The first family to notice an absence were the Knoblings, as the last person to see David was his little brother Michael. He had told his now worried parents that he'd last seen David take off in his truck yesterday evening. While the Knoblings were already frantically making plans to look for David, the Edwards, on the other hand, were much calmer. They'd initially assumed Robin had regressed to her former behavior, and that she'd run away again like she often did in the past. Her parents didn't want to believe that was the case, as Robin had shown a lot of progress during her family counseling sessions. But there was no other feasible explanation for her absence at the time, so they decided to wait for her to reach out or come home like she usually did whenever she ran away. But when Robin never reached out, the Edwards family knew there was a problem. As more hours passed by, the Edwards started to believe that Robin didn't just run away this time, and that she might have been taken. 24 hours had already passed, and there was still no sign of David or Robin, so their families informed the Virginia State Police of their disappearance, and a search was carried out to find the missing persons. On September 21, 1987, the streets of Virginia were filled with numerous search party groups. The Virginian authorities led the search, and they were assisted by the Knobling and Edwards families. Most search groups focused on the last places they had seen David and Robin, so the cities of Newport News and Hampton, in addition to the neighboring vicinities, were prioritized. As expected, David's father, Carl Knobling, was one of the first people on the streets of Virginia during the search for his son. The Knobling family still had hope during the search, as they told themselves that David might just be taking some days to himself. But all the hope they had vanished when they came across a troubling discovery during their search. While there were still no signs of either of them, the authorities had received news that David's black Ford Ranger truck had been found by a patrolman at Ragged Island near Smithfield. The pickup truck was located at the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge's parking area, and the authorities found the car with the engine, radio, and wipers still running. The truck's doors were also wide open, and the driver's window was slightly rolled down. After securing the area, the detectives inspected the car's interior, and they found a few articles of clothing, in addition to David's wallet on the dashboard. The detectives viewed the discovery of David's truck as a success, and they believed it could lead them to his whereabouts. The presence of his wallet had also given the detectives their first clue, as it made it clear that this wasn't a robbery. But while the detectives saw the finding of David's truck as their first triumph, the Knobling family didn't share the same views, as they now feared the worst. They knew how much David loved that truck, and they also knew he would never have abandoned it willingly. However, even with their diminished hope, the Knobling family kept a brave face as they continued with the search. The search parties weren't able to find anything else that day. Both the Knoblings and the Edwards tried to keep their hopeful thoughts alive, as they all wished for David and Robin to show up soon and tell everyone that everything was okay. But unfortunately for both families, that wasn't the case. On September 23, 1987, the bodies of 20-year-old David Lee Knobling and the 14-year-old Robin Edwards were found near the shoreline of Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, just 30 minutes from Colonial Parkway, Virginia. Their corpses had been washed ashore by the tide, and they were found about 100 feet apart from each other. The detectives who were on the ghastly scene also noted that the location of their bodies was only a few miles downriver from the James River Bridge where David's black Ford Ranger had been found on the 21st. It was a truly horrific sight that turned the stomachs of everyone there, and the news appalled the entire state of Virginia. The crime scene was quickly secured after the discovery of the bodies. The detectives on the scene could already tell from their initial inspections that both David and Robin had been shot. However, further investigations by forensic experts would later reveal more disturbing details. These reports showed that the killer had carried out an execution-style shooting, as he had shot her in the back of the head. Things only got worse from there, as the reports also revealed that she had been assaulted. The assault report did not come as a shock to the first responders, as they had already noticed some signs on the crime scene that pointed to that outcome. They had picked up on these signs while retrieving the bodies, as the detectives noticed that both David and Robin were partially clothed. Robin's jeans were unfastened, and her bra was found around her neck. The same was said for David, as he was also missing articles of clothing, but most of the emphasis was on Robin, as it was much more evident in her case. As for David's autopsy report, the forensics stated that he was murdered in a similar fashion. But unlike Robin, he was shot twice. The killer had put a bullet in his head and another in his shoulder. With the post-mortem examination out of the way, the authorities put all their focus into trying to build a timeline that would explain why the victims had come to that particular location or the events that led up to the murder. But no matter how hard they looked, nothing at the crime scene could definitively tell the detectives what David and Robin had been doing at Ragged Island at that time. Some detectives on the scene speculated that despite Robin being underage, there might have been a relationship between her and David. This theory also made some investigators question whether she had been assaulted, as they were still unsure of the actual details that led up to the murder. However, despite further investigations, this particular theory was never confirmed, as the detectives were not able to definitively prove any of it. So the assault charge that was reported by the forensics remained the same throughout the investigation. The detectives continued to study the double homicide case as the days passed by, and it was not long before they started to notice a pattern. For starters, the murders of David and Robin were oddly similar to another gruesome murder that happened over a year ago in Virginia. The case the detectives were referring to was the murders of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. And one of the major things these two cases had in common was a place called the Colonial Parkway. The Colonial Parkway is a 22-mile-long road that stretches the Colonial National Historical Park in Virginia. This roadway connects the two Virginian cities of Jamestown and Yorktown, and it runs by way of Williamsburg. This particular roadway was also known to the locals as a popular lover's lane, and this was due to the fact that there were lengthy stretches of the road that were very isolated. In addition to its secluded nature, these parts of the road bore little to no streetlights, making it a very private and quiet area. So numerous new lovers, who were usually young adults, often frequented the location to share their passions. The activities that went on there were widely known to the locals, and almost every couple in the vicinity took trips there, usually after dates or casual nights out. But in the year 1986, the romantic Colonial Parkway had become a hunting ground for an unhinged serial killer who had taken it upon himself to bring a gruesome end to any young lovers that he came across. Unfortunately, the first couple that fell into his hands were the two young women named Kathleen Mary Ann Thomas and Rebecca Ann Dowski. The young couple was murdered on the 12th of October, 1986, and the double homicide was so gruesome that it made the front page of the New York Post. Investigations were quickly carried out into both victims, and it was soon revealed that the 27-year-old Kathleen Thomas was a U.S. Naval Academy graduate. She was also a former Navy lieutenant who worked as a stockbroker in Norfolk, Virginia at the time of her murder. Further investigations later showed that she had been considering going to graduate school while she worked as a stockbroker. During the investigation, additional information also came to light concerning Kathleen's 21-year-old partner, Rebecca Dowski. Rebecca was a college student who majored in senior business administration. Her record showed that she had transferred from Dickinson College in Pennsylvania to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. She also had 2 jobs as she worked as a clerk in the English department, while also caring for the 2-year-olds at a daycare center. It was unclear how the pair had met, but the detectives assumed they had crossed paths due to their close proximity of their 2 cities. The investigative report showed that the couple kept a low profile as same-sex relationships were still frowned upon in the military at that time. So Kathleen and Rebecca preferred to go out together in private and less crowded areas. Similar to many young lovers in Virginia, the couple chose the Colonial Parkway as a desirable destination to spend some time with each other. But unfortunately, neither Kathleen nor Rebecca came back alive from the parkway. The bodies of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were found a few days after they had been reported missing by a jogger who was passing by the Colonial Parkway route. They were both in Kathleen's 1980 Honda Civic. The car was left with its doors open, and Kathleen's wallet was one of the first things the detectives noticed in the car's interior. The vehicle was located down an embankment off the Colonial Parkway, and it was close to a Navy facility in York County called Cheatham Annex. It was a ghastly crime scene as both Kathleen and Rebecca's throats had been viciously cut and slashed open with a blade. Further inspection by the authorities showed signs that they had also been strangled, and a post-mortem examination carried out later by the forensics corroborated this as they found significant signs of asphyxiation. Additional investigations also revealed that the killer had pushed the car over the embankment before unsuccessfully trying to set the car on fire. The gruesome deaths of Kathleen and Rebecca shocked every resident in Virginia, as they all knew that a deranged killer was now loose in their once safe state. The double homicide case became a priority for the Virginia State Police, as they carried out numerous investigations to identify and bring the killer to justice. However, despite their endless efforts, they were not able to find any traces of the murderer. The case remained unsolved for months, as detectives still had no clues as to the killer's whereabouts. Things remained like this for a while, and it wasn't long before a year passed by. The tensions had slowly eased down in the state of Virginia at this point. The authorities had not heard or seen any signs or traces of the killer, which led them to believe that the killer had gone off-grid. But that was until he claimed the lives of David Knobling and Robin Edwards, nearly a year later, on the 19th of September 1987. The detectives now had 2 double homicide cases on their hands, and the killer had eluded them once again. During their investigations, they tried to piece together the similarities in these cases, and the first thing that came to their minds was the staging of the victims' vehicles. The investigators knew that both David's and Kathleen's cars had been staged by the killer, and they believed this was his pattern. The killer also seemed to only target couples, or people who seemed to be couples, like the case of David and Robin. Apart from these 2 similarities, the main and the most prominent similarity was the Colonial Parkway. The detectives knew that a killer or a group of killers had chosen the Colonial Parkway and its surrounding vicinities, which were also considered lovers' lanes, as a hotspot to choose potential victims. With 4 separate murder investigations now open, the detectives hoped the gruesome double homicides would be the last murders in the state of Virginia, but, unfortunately for them, their hopes were misplaced, as the bloodshed and the corpses only grew to greater heights in the following years. The next double homicide happened less than 7 months after the deaths of David and Robin, and even at that point, neither the cases of Kathleen and Rebecca nor David and Robin had been solved. This time, the unlucky couple were the 18-year-old Cassandra Haley and the 20-year-old Richard Keith Call. The pair were both students of Christopher Newport University. They both met at the university where they headed off, and it was not long before they decided to go on their first date. Unfortunately for the new couple, they never returned for their classes the following day. On the 10th of April, 1988, Richard Call and Cassandra Haley were last seen by witnesses leaving a party at 2 a.m., and no one had seen them since. Even though they had only been missing for a few hours, a search was carried out to locate them, and after nearly 6 hours, Richard's car was found, abandoned at the York River Overlook located on the Colonial Parkway. The detectives on the scene did not want to jump to the worst conclusion, so they assumed the couple had gone swimming in the cold York River and drowned. This seemed like a plausible explanation at the time, as they did not want to quickly tie the case to the growing string of murders on the Colonial Parkway. However, after an exhaustive and extensive search of the river, no traces of Cassandra's or Richard's bodies were found. As much as they did not want to admit it, the detectives knew that the disappearances of the couple was the handiwork of the Colonial Parkway killer. Further investigations had already shown similar patterns in the case, one of them being the location of the vehicle, as Cassandra and Richard's car was found just 3 miles from where Kathleen and Rebecca were murdered. This double homicide case of Cassandra and Richard was eventually added to the remaining 2 double homicide cases, and this one was particularly worse for the detectives and the families of the victims, because no matter how hard the authorities tried, they could never find the bodies. The state of Virginia was in a state of constant fear at this point. Over 6 people had been murdered, and the detectives still did not have any answers for their grieving families, or the community as a whole. They were doing everything they could to identify the killer, but all their investigations seemed to take them nowhere. As time went by, the unrest and the anxiety of the Virginian residents reached greater heights, and amidst all the growing death and chaos, another woman was murdered. A new homicide case had now been added to the still unsolved colonial murder cases, and as the number of dead bodies grew to 7, so did the pressure on the detectives. However, there was something different about the recent homicide case because, unlike the other 6 cases, the murder did not take place at the Colonial Parkway. The woman, who would later be identified as Teresa Lynn Howell, was murdered in Hampton City, and while the detectives initially thought it was an isolated case, further investigations showed that the person who killed David Knobling and Robin Edwards in 1987 was the very same person who had killed this woman. So an in-depth investigation was quickly carried out into Teresa Howell. Teresa Lynn Spa Howell was born on the 25th of August, 1959, to parents Malden Pierce and Elizabeth Spa. She was a sweet woman who was fondly called Terry by her family and close friends. She fell in love in her late adolescent years, and she got married on the 10th of May, 1981. She lived in Hampton with her husband, who was in the military service during the years of their marriage, and the couple later had 2 children. Teresa loved being a mother, but martial life was not easy after the first few years. She had been suffering from substance abuse and depression at the time, in addition to growing financial problems. All this soon led to problems between her and her husband, and the couple eventually divorced in August of 1985. During the divorce hearing, the judge awarded custody of her children to her husband due to her problems with drug and alcohol abuse. Losing the custody battle deeply hurt Teresa, so she admitted herself to a drug abuse treatment program in June of 1989. Teresa, who was still in an ongoing divorce at the time, lived alone in a Pines of York apartment complex building located on Route 134 in Hampton, Virginia, during the treatment program. A little while after undergoing her drug abuse treatment program, Teresa attempted to move on with her life. So she went out one night to a then popular spot called the Zodiac Club, located at East Mercury Boulevard in Hampton, Virginia. The night was supposed to be a fun and exciting night for her as she tried to clear her head and move on from her past. But unbeknownst to her, Teresa's night of fun would eventually turn into a night of horrors as she went missing a few hours after leaving the nightclub. And the worst part was that no one noticed until it was too late. On the 1st of July, 1989, the Virginia State Police received a disturbing call during the very early hours of that Saturday. The call came from a York County construction worker who had followed a trail of women's clothing that had been scattered everywhere in pieces, and it led him to a woman's corpse that was lying in a wooded area at the 500 block of Butler Farm Road. The Virginia State Police immediately made their way to the location to retrieve the body of the then unidentified woman. The site where her body had been dumped was still being developed at the time as part of Hampton Road Center off Magruder Boulevard. It took about 3 days after the horrific discovery for the authorities to identify the corpse, and her identity was revealed when the Virginia State Police received a missing persons report for Teresa Lynn Howell on the 4th of July, 1989. An investigation was quickly carried out by the detectives as they tried to piece together the victim's timeline in her final moments. Once the initial investigation was over, the investigators had managed to piece together some of the information they needed. Starting with her age, the detectives found out that the missing person was the 29-year-old Teresa Lynn Spa Howell, and she was last seen around 2:30 a.m. leaving the well-known Zodiac Club on East Mercury Boulevard. The authorities knew that it was too early to declare her missing at the time, as it had just been a few hours, which explained why no one was alerted of her disappearance. Over 7 hours then passed from that point before the authorities finally received a call from the construction worker concerning Teresa's whereabouts. Having gathered more knowledge about Teresa, the detectives now realized that her body had been found just 4 miles away from her apartment complex building and 5 miles away from the Zodiac nightclub. Additional investigations into Teresa's homicide later revealed more disturbing details, as the detectives also noted that while she was not killed on the Colonial Parkway, the location of her murder was just 15 miles from where the bodies of David Knobling and Robin Edwards had been located 2 years earlier in 1987. The forensics, who had also carried out the post-mortem examinations, later stated in their reports that, similar to the case of 14-year-old Robin Edwards, Teresa Howell had also been assaulted. The report then stated strangulation as the cause of death, as there were signs of asphyxiation during the examination. Despite the connections to the double homicide case of David Knobling and Robin Edwards, the detectives did not consider Teresa's death as part of the Colonial Parkway killings, even though they were convinced that the person who killed Teresa was also responsible for David and Robin's deaths. They believed Teresa's homicide should be separated and treated as its own case, so they carried out a separate homicide investigation into her death. The news of Teresa's death spread across the state of Virginia like wildfire, as the detectives began investigations into the 7th homicide case. The Spa family did not handle her death well, as Teresa had been killed just 10 days before her divorce was finalized, and they demanded answers. But as the weeks passed by, the detectives had nothing to give to the grieving family, as the killer had vanished into thin air. The authorities knew the state of Virginia couldn't handle another death after the murder of Teresa Howell, so they tried as much as possible to be on high alert as they hoped to thwart any new homicide before it happened. But the killer was already one step ahead of them. On the 5th of September 1989, 2 more people went missing on the streets of Virginia. The latest missing residents were soon identified as 21-year-old Daniel Lauer and 18-year-old Anna Maria Phelps. The detectives quickly looked into their background to see if they were another unfortunate couple that fell prey to the colonial killer. But they found out that Anna Maria was actually dating Daniel's brother, a man named Clint Lauer. Anna Maria and Clint had been living together in Virginia Beach, but the couple had fallen on hard times. Clint had recently lost his job working at the Wendy's restaurant. Things got even worse from there, as the couple had also lost power in their home. During this difficult period, Clint's brother Daniel had decided to visit him and Anna Maria at their home in Virginia Beach. Daniel made the trip to his brother's home, and he brought his wife, a woman named Jo Godsey, in addition to their infant daughter. As the days of the visit passed by, Daniel saw how much his brother and his girlfriend were struggling. So after much thought, he decided to move in with Clint and Anna Maria, so he could help out with rent and additional fees at their home. The couple didn't hesitate to accept Daniel's offer, as they really needed the help. So after the weekend was over, Daniel went back home to Amelia County, Virginia to drop off his wife and child before coming back to live with his brother. But Anna Maria, who wanted to take the opportunity to see some of her family back in Amelia County, innocently decided to tag along. Daniel then drove them back to Amelia County safely, and he dropped off his family before dropping Anna Maria with her relatives. He then went back home to pack some personal items before collecting his last paycheck from his father for some painting work he'd done for his painting business. Anna Maria had managed to spend a few minutes with her family before Daniel came to get her. After saying goodbye, they both made their way back to Virginia Beach to an expectant Clint, who was waiting patiently for them. But unfortunately for him, neither his brother nor his girlfriend ever returned. It wasn't the first time Daniel had made the 2 or so hour drive from Amelia County to Virginia Beach on eastbound I-64. During the long drive, he looked forward to starting a new life with his brother and Anna Maria at Virginia Beach, and he planned to visit his wife and daughter at any chance he could. But unbeknownst to him, he and Anna Maria would mysteriously go missing on their drive back home. On the 5th of September 1989, Daniel's Chevrolet Nova was found abandoned on a westbound rest stop off Interstate 64 in New Kent County. The car was oddly stationed on the merge acceleration ramp that was on the other side of the highway. It was parked at a strange angle, and the driver's window was halfway down. The authorities found both doors unlocked, with Daniel's keys in the ignition. Upon further inspection, they found Anna Maria's purse in the car and Daniel's packed luggage in the back seat. They also noticed that Daniel's feathered roach clip that was usually hung on the rearview mirror was now dangling from the car's window. Many detectives on the scene initially thought the pair had run away, but that theory was quickly disproven with further investigations, as it looked like the Colonial Parkway killer had struck again. The detectives knew that, similar to his other murders, the car had been staged, and the killer left the key in the ignition, hoping that someone would take it. After the car and the scene had been secured, an immediate search was carried out by the authorities to find Daniel Lauer and Anna Marie Phelps. But the search proved difficult, as the surrounding areas were covered with a lot of dense woods and trees, and even with the use of a helicopter, they couldn't spot any traces of them on the ground. The detectives knew how important time was in finding them, so they tried all they could in the following days to locate Daniel and Anna Maria. But due to the location and the terrain, it was nearly impossible. Things only got worse from there, as it began to rain heavily in the weeks that followed. And similar to the double homicide case of Cassandra Haley and Richard Cull, it slowly started to seem like they were never going to find their bodies. But 7 weeks later, a couple of turkey hunters came across 2 rotting corpses in the forest. Daniel and Anna Maria's bodies were found on the 19th of October, 1989. They were discovered by a few hunters that were hunting in the area. The authorities found their remains about a mile west from the westbound rest area, just off a logging road. But Daniel and Anna Maria's bodies were covered with an electric blanket that had been taken from Daniel's car. And the authorities managed to find Anna Maria's locket on the narrow logging and secluded trail in the woods where the decomposing corpses had been placed. After retrieving their bodies, an autopsy was carried out to find out how they died. The detectives hoped the results would give them a strong lead as they waited patiently for it. However, the post-mortem examination proved difficult for forensic, as both bodies had already decayed due to the time they had spent out there. After extensive examinations, they were only able to deduce Anna Maria's cause of death. Her remains indicated multiple stab wounds, and the report stated that she had been stabbed. There were no conclusive reports for Daniel, as his remains were too far decomposed to show any definite results. Despite the successful retrieval of Daniel's and Anna Maria's remains, the entire state of Virginia was outraged. The bodies had helped the detectives to gather more information for the investigation, but it was also an embarrassment and disgrace to the authorities, who had claimed that they had been doing everything to find them. They had completely failed at carrying out a proper search, and detectives knew that if they had located their bodies 24 hours after the crime, they would have been able to get more substantial evidence or clues that could lead to the killer. The case was quickly considered one of the Colonial Parkway cases, as it was clear to the authorities that the twisted killer was trying to recreate what he had done at Colonial Parkway. They also believed that, similar to the David Knobling and Robin Edwards case, the killer assumed Daniel and Anna Maria were a couple, which is why he attacked them, as they appeared to be together romantically at the time of their murder. Another recurring pattern the detectives had noticed again was the staging of Daniel's car, as it was carried out in the same manner as Kathleen's car on the Colonial Parkway and David's car at Ragged Island. One of the state police agents, Officer Larry McCann, spoke more extensively on the car's staging, particularly the placement of Daniel's roach clip, as he believed the killer placed it there to taunt authorities, urging them to look at what he had done and reminding them that they couldn't catch him. The Virginian authorities were made to look like fools as they were outsmarted once again. The killer, who was now being called the Phantom of Colonial, had pulled his vanishing act, and the detectives could do nothing to identify the murderous romantic. The murderers became infamous as they were now known everywhere as the Colonial Parkway murders, and it wasn't long before the FBI got involved. The authorities knew they couldn't let this killer strike again, so they took every necessary measure and waited with bated breaths to catch him. But they ended up waiting for years, as the Phantom of the Colonial Parkway was never heard from again. Over 6 years had passed since the Phantom of the Colonial Parkway was heard from at this point, and the authorities still had no leads on his identity. Some detectives began to speculate that the killer might be a member of law enforcement. This theory was due to the fact that most of the victim's staged vehicles were found with the driver's window rolled partway down. The detectives had already noted it earlier in the case of David Knobling and Robin Edwards, as David's wallet was found on the dashboard, which would mean that whoever stopped them was probably a uniformed officer, or someone pretending to be a uniformed officer, so that he could get them to stop. The detectives strongly believed in this theory, as the patterns were also present in Kathleen's and Daniel's cars. But while the detectives thought this lead would get them to the killer, it only led them nowhere, as they couldn't match the killer to anyone in law enforcement. The authorities then came to the conclusion that the killer probably acquired a uniform that he used to impersonate or pose as an official officer to stop his victims' cars on the roadway. However, even though the detectives were convinced of this theory, they didn't know where to start tracking him down, as the detectives knew it was basically impossible to profile him among the 6 million residents who lived in Virginia at the time. With their first theory falling apart, the detectives decided to focus on the connection that David Knobling and Robin Edwards' case had with the Teresa Spa Howell case. As stated earlier, Teresa's case was never considered part of the Colonial Parkway case, but the detectives knew all three were killed by the same person. Teresa's case was being handled separately at the time, and Lieutenant Detective Eddie Watts was in charge. Detective Watts, who had been working tirelessly on the Teresa case with his team, already had two theories about Teresa's murder. The first possible theory was that Teresa had actually been killed at a different location before the killer dumped her body at the construction site in Hampton Roads Center, off Magruder Boulevard. Detective Watts and his team were convinced that they would be able to get the killer if they could find or track down the original crime scene where Teresa's murder took place. But there wasn't enough evidence to prove that there was another possible crime scene out there where Teresa was murdered. Detective Watts and his team quickly moved on to their second theory, one that saw the killer stage the crime scene after the murder. They believed that in the second scenario, the killer had strategically scattered pieces of Teresa's clothing in different piles, so the authorities would believe she had been assaulted. The detectives also explained the reasoning behind this theory, as they believed the killer did all this because he wanted to convince the authorities that his motive was, which would lead them away from uncovering the real motive behind her murder. However, none of these theories were substantial due to the lack of definite evidence. The pressure from the grieving Spa family had grown to extreme heights at this point. They told the authorities that they wanted answers and justice, not theories. The investigation changed leadership during this period, as it was now led by Detective Edgar Browning. And on the 26th of May 1995, they finally arrested a suspect. The authorities arrested a 32-year-old man named Clinton Wayne Edwards. He was an unemployed carpenter who lived in Newport News. An investigation carried out by Detective Browning and his partner Detective Randy Seals in Miami, Florida, had led to Mr. Edwards as their main suspect. They had gathered some witness statements during an interview that placed Edwards at the Zodiac nightclub that night. Edwards was one of the 200 people that the detectives had interviewed, and further investigations showed that there was DNA evidence that linked him to the crime scene. The arrest of Clinton Wayne Edwards was seen as a big win for the detectives, as they hoped his capture would shed light on the Colonial Parkway murders, particularly the David Knobling and Robin Edwards case. The detectives were convinced that they had their man, and they charged him with capital murder. But as their investigations continued, it didn't take the authorities long to realize that they had incarcerated the wrong man. Further investigations showed that there was a mistake with the DNA evidence they had used to pin Clinton Wayne Edwards. By the time the detectives realized this massive error, Clinton Wayne Edwards had already spent 4 months in custody, but they had no choice but to let him go. The authorities suffered another embarrassment after the arrest of an innocent man, and they found themselves back to square one on the Teresa Spa Howell case. They tried their best to move on from the blunder, as they carried out many more investigations after that to solve the murder case. But the detectives were so perplexed during the investigation that they were unable to focus on a single theory that could plausibly explain why Teresa was killed. 7 years had passed by at this point in the case, and solving the Colonial Parkway murders proved impossible for the detectives. It was the same situation with the Teresa Spa Howell case, as nothing they did seemed to work. They had exhausted basically every angle they could with over 300 interrogations and an absurd amount of investigations, but they still had no answers for the 9 murders that took place all those years ago. The detectives didn't want to admit it, but it was clear to everyone that they had slowly begun to lose steam, and it wasn't long before all 9 homicide cases went cold. On the 7th of December 2020, nearly 32 years after the Colonial Parkway murders, FBI Special Agent Brian Dugan was put in charge of the FBI Norfolk Field Office in Virginia. After his installment, Agent Dugan was one of the many agents who were tasked to assist the Virginia authorities in solving the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders. Numerous detectives and FBI agents had already tried and failed over the past 30 years to solve the case, but Special Agent Brian Dugan didn't let that deter him, as he was determined to crack the case and give answers to the still grieving families. He spent years studying and reviewing every piece of evidence, witness statements, and interrogation files that were associated with the cold cases. It was a long and difficult task, but in late 2023, he and his team finally had a breakthrough. Agent Dugan began the revamped investigation into the Colonial Parkway murders during the last months of 2023 by telling his team to cross-check the DNA samples found at the crime scenes and see if there were any matches in their database. A few investigators who were also working on the case told Agent Dugan that doing this was pointless, as they had been running the DNA samples through the database for the past 25 years, and they never got a definitive match. However, Agent Dugan was convinced this would give them a lead, as he told them that the database had grown significantly over the past few years, and they had nothing to lose by running it again. Following Agent Dugan's instructions, the Virginia Department of Forensic Science ran the same test that they had been carrying out for the past 2 decades. But to everyone's amazement, there was a definite match. The discovery came as a shock to everyone in the room. According to the forensic report, the genetic material that they ran matched the DNA samples found at the double homicide crime scene of David Knobling and Robin Edwards. The same DNA also matched the genetic samples present at Teresa Howell's crime scene. They ran the tests again to make sure there were no mistakes, and at the end of it all, the forensic department, who were completely sure of their results, issued a certificate of analysis confirming the genetic match found at the 2 crime scenes with the DNA sample. After the results had been successfully cross-checked for errors, an investigation was quickly carried out into the matching DNA sample, as the investigators wanted to know who it belonged to and when the sample was added to the database. After their investigations, it was revealed that the DNA sample was taken and introduced into the database nearly 6 years ago, in the year 2017. Additional investigations carried out by the investigators showed that the matching DNA sample had been retrieved on the 15th of December 2017, when a delivery driver had called the Virginia State Police telling them he had found a man lying dead in his home. After arriving on the scene, the unnamed delivery driver told the officers that he had found the man's door open, and he discovered the body when he walked into the house's entrance to see if anyone was home. The authorities could already tell that the corpse had been there for a few weeks due to its state of decay. The investigators believed that he had probably died alone, and no one noticed until the delivery man came. But due to the state of the body, they decided to check for foul play. The state medical examiner's office was then called in to investigate the rotting remains, so they could identify the man and the cause of death. The medical examiners then collected the DNA samples from the decomposed corpse to begin their test. After the post-mortem examinations had been carried out, the results showed that there was no foul play, as the man had died due to hardening of his arteries. Once the authorities learned the individual had died from natural causes, the case was closed, and his remains were sent to his family. But his DNA remained in the database, and after a few years had passed, his DNA resurfaced and was a perfect match for the DNA samples found on 2 crime scenes related to the Colonial Parkway murders. FBI Special Agent Brian Dugan and his team of investigators rejoiced at the discovery because after 36 long years, they had finally put a face and a name to the phantom of the Colonial Parkway. The man was identified as Alan Wilmer Sr., and an investigation was immediately carried out to find out everything about him. Alan Wade Wilmer was born on the 18th of November 1954 in Lancaster County, Virginia, to parents William Wesley and Jane Elizabeth Wilmer. Alan liked to keep to himself as a child, and he was often called Pokey by the people who knew him. He remained a loner as he grew into adulthood. He had little to no friends, and he often kept to himself. Alan worked as a fisherman in the 1980s, and he specialized in catching clams and oysters. He had also built a custom-built wooden boat that was called the Denny Wade. He lived on the commercial boat during his fishing trips, and the boat was often docked in Middlesex County, Gloucester County, Northern Neck, and a few other areas in the Hampton Roads. Whenever he wasn't fishing, Alan lived alone at his home on Meyer Creek Road in Lancaster County. He had been married once in the past, but it ended in divorce, and he had 2 children who were now adults. Alan owned a few vehicles that were parked at his home, and he often drove a blue 1966 Dodge Fargo pickup truck. It was a very distinctive car with a Virginia license plate that read EMRAW, an abbreviation for the sentence "Eat 'em raw." The truck always had clamming equipment and a large metal toolbox in the back, as he usually took the truck for work purposes. Despite his reclusive and introverted nature, Alan was a very active man. He was a keen hunter and a proud member of his local Middle Peninsula Hunt Club. The in-depth investigation carried out by the investigators into Alan's life showed that he was an avid hunter who frequently moved around the state of Virginia in his boat and truck, which made him the perfect candidate to carry out the murders. While he had managed to get a clean record throughout his life, further investigations showed that it wasn't the first time his name had come up in the investigation. He was once considered a suspect in the double homicide case of Cassandra Haley and Richard Call. A few witnesses had seen him approach the couple along the Colonial Parkway. And FBI Special Agent Irvin B. Wells III, who was in charge of the FBI's Norfolk field office in 2016, put Allen under surveillance. During their surveillance, the agent saw Alan Wilmer spray painting and cleaning one of his older model trucks a few days after Richard and Cassandra's death, and this put him under suspicion. It wasn't long after that before they got a search warrant for his house. But after the search, the agents only found a registered gun and some handcuffs. Even though the agents were suspicious, they knew that there was no substantial evidence against him. And despite all their interrogations, Allen kept claiming that he wasn't guilty. Still not convinced, the agents asked him to prove his innocence by taking a lie detector test, and Allen quickly agreed. One of the best polygraph specialists was brought in to question him, and at the end of the session, the specialist assured the agents that Alan Wilmer was innocent. Despite the results, Special Agent Wells was still convinced that Allen had something to do with the Colonial Parkway murders. But with no definite evidence to prove it, Alan Wilmer was let go. The authorities never heard from him again, until the 15th of December, when Alan Wilmer Sr. was found dead in his home, located across the Rappahannock River from Middlesex County, Virginia. The agents who were working on the case knew how lucky they were that Alan's DNA was taken at his death and added to the database, as it was the crucial evidence that helped them finally connect him to 3 of the 9 crime scenes. Special Agent Brian Dugan later made statements on how fortunate it was that Alan's DNA was on record before he was put into the ground. While giving his statement, Agent Dugan made it clear that the only reason the Virginian authorities couldn't solve the homicide cases for 36 years was because Alan Wilmer had no felonies on his criminal record, so his DNA had never been collected by Virginian authorities while he was alive. It was all thanks to the medical examiners who had taken Alan's DNA when he died, because the authorities knew that they would have never been able to solve the case and bring justice to the families without it. On the 8th of January 2024, the Virginia State Police named Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. as the main suspect in the 1987 double homicide case of David Knobling and Robin Edwards. The announcement was also made by multiple law enforcement agencies, as they revealed that he was also responsible for the death and of Teresa Spa Howell in 1989. The authorities then gave the public some unfortunate news, as they informed the residents of Virginia that due to his untimely death, on the 15th of December 2017 at the age of 63, Alan Wilmer couldn't face prosecution for his crimes. Even though the families of the 3 victims never got to see Alan Wilmer behind bars, they were content with the closure they got from knowing his identity. The surviving families of David Knobling and Robin Edwards, who told the press that they felt connected to each other, made a joint statement to the press saying, "For 36 years, our families have lived in a vacuum of the unknown. We have lived with the fear of worrying that a person capable of deliberately killing Robin and David could attack and claim another victim. Now we have a sense of relief and justice, knowing that he can no longer victimize another. His death will not allow us to seek out the answers to countless questions that have haunted us for so long." After the joint statement, Robin's sister Janet Santiago gave a personal and emotional interview to the press, where she reflected on the murder. She then told the press that she couldn't imagine going through the horrors her sister went through at the age of 14. The Howell family also spoke to the press, as they gave a statement that read, "While we are grateful for the closure that has been provided, nothing will bring Terry back. The void left by her absence over the years is inexpressible." The identification of Alan Wade Wilmer as the one responsible for the deaths of David Knobling, Robin Edwards and Teresa Howell, made the families of the remaining Colonial Parkway case victims start to ask questions, as they wondered if he too was responsible for the murders of their loved ones. Kathleen Thomas's brother, a man named Bill Thomas, was one of the relatives who had spoken out. He told the press that he and Kathleen's mother, who were already gone and their 83-year-old father was no longer able to handle the stress. Bill also stated that he had been asking investigators for answers throughout the years, and that he hoped he wouldn't have to pass the responsibility to his son if the authorities weren't able to solve his sister's murder case in his lifetime. The Virginia State Police spokeswoman, Miss Corinne Geller, told both the remaining families and the press that while the other cases remain active, there was still no physical or forensic evidence that currently linked Alan Wilmer to the remaining 6 murders. In an effort to gather more evidence, law enforcement agencies are currently asking the public for tips about Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. And anyone with information about Alan or his movements over the years he was alive is asked to call the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov. The bizarre case of Alan Wade Wilmer is one that still shocks many detectives to this date. The ghastly case also sheds light on the limitations of law enforcement agencies in certain scenarios, and it proves just how much luck plays a role in helping to solve many cold cases today. We'd love to know your thoughts on the case, as there are still many unanswered questions. Do you think Alan Wilmer was the one responsible for all the Colonial Parkway murders? Or are there other killers still out there roaming the streets of Virginia? Feel free to discuss your thoughts and opinions on these questions in the comment section below. And if you would like us to cover a case, please drop your recommendation in the comment section as well. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping true crime stories like this.